History, as we know it, is a curated collection of victories. We are told that humanity conquered the stars with precision, with bravery, and with a few celebrated heroes. We know the name Yuri Gagarin. We know the date, April 12, 1961, but history is often written in ink that covers up the blood. There is a different history or shadow history that was not recorded in the newspapers of Moscow or Washington. It was recorded on magnetic tape, in a small privately built bunker in the Italian Alps. While the world cheered for the official launches, the static of the upper atmosphere carried the voices of the ghosts, the ones who didn't come back, the ones who screamed into the void while the Kremlin claimed they never existed. These files were meant to remain encrypted, erased, and forgotten in the burn bags of the Soviet space program. But the signal was intercepted. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight with the sound of a heartbeat that stopped beating 60 years ago. The only sound now is the low electric hum of vacuum tubes warming up. Imagine a room, cold and dimly lit by the green glow of an assault. It is not a military base. It is not a government facility. It is a repurposed concrete structure on the outskirts of Turin, Italy. The year is 1957, and the air is thick with the invisible tension of the Cold War. Outside, the wind moves through the trees of the distinct Italian landscape, but inside, the atmosphere is sterile. Driven by the smell of soldering iron and ozone. We are entering the world of Torre Bert. To the casual observer, it looks like nothing more than an amateur radio enthusiast's workshop. But look closer at the equipment. The dials are set to frequencies that civilian radios are not supposed to reach. The antennas, constructed from scavenged parts and sheer mathematical genius, are pointed not at radio stations, but at the sky. Specifically, they are tracking a trajectory that moves across the Soviet Union, arcing over Europe, and vanishing into the silence of the Atlantic. This is where the truth was caught, not with a camera, but with a wire. To understand the mystery of the Lost Cosmonauts, we must first understand the architecture of the ear that heard them. The narrative centers on two brothers, Achille and Giovanni, in the grand theater of the space race, where superpowers were spending billions of dollars to assert dominance over the heavens. These two brothers were an anomaly. They were not funded by the CIA. They were not on the payroll of the KGB. They were students. Achille was studying medicine, interested in the physiology of the human heart. Giovanni was the engineer, obsessed with the physics of radio waves. Together, they possessed a dangerous combination of skills: the ability to build technology that rivaled state intelligence agencies, and the medical knowledge to understand exactly what a human body sounds like when it is dying in orbit. Let us analyze the location itself. Torre Bert. The name sounds unassuming, almost pastoral. It was a listening station built on the foundation of a defunct German bunker from the Second World War. There is a poetic irony in this. Concrete walls that were once built to defend against Allied bombs were now being used to eavesdrop on the secrets of the communist bloc. The brothers chose this location for its isolation and its acoustic purity. The electrical interference from the city of Turin was minimal here. The signal-to-noise ratio was perfect for hunting weak transmissions, bouncing off the ionosphere. The brothers began their work in the late 1950s, a time when the sky was becoming a new ocean to be sailed. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1. It was a metal sphere, 23 inches in diameter, polishing the ego of the East. It did very little, functionally speaking. It simply orbited and beeped. That beepy beep was the heartbeat of the new age. It terrified the West. It signaled that the technological gap had closed. But while the American military scrambled to track Sputnik using massive radar arrays, Achille and Giovanni tracked it from their bedroom. They had built a receiver capable of picking up the 20.005 and 40.002 megahertz frequencies that Sputnik used. This was their first taste of the truth. They realized that the sky was not silent. It was shouting, if you knew how to listen. However, the brothers were not content with simply tracking metal spheres. As they upgraded their equipment at Torre Bert, constructing larger mobile antennas and refining their signal filtering processes, they began to search for something else. They knew, through logical deduction, that the ultimate goal of the Soviet space program was not to send metal into space, but to send a man. And before you send a man, you send animals. And before you succeed with a man, you likely fail. The Soviet Union operated under a strict policy of silence. A mission was only announced after it was a success. If a rocket exploded on the launch pad, it never happened. If a capsule failed to re-enter and drifted off into the blackness of eternal orbit, the pilot was simply erased from the records. Their photos were airbrushed out of group pictures. Their names were removed from archives. They became unpersons, but radio waves do not respect censorship. Radio waves travel at the speed of light, expanding in a sphere from their point of origin. Once a signal is transmitted, a voice, a heartbeat, a code, it exists forever. Traveling outward, you cannot burn a radio wave. You can only hope no one is listening when it arrives. The Giudica Cordiglia brothers were listening. They called their setup the rover. It was a massive steerable antenna array capable of tracking satellites as they rotated around the Earth. They memorized the flight paths. They calculated the Doppler shift, the way a sound changes pitch as the source moves towards or away from you. This is a critical concept in our analysis. The Doppler shift was their lie detector. If the Soviets claimed a satellite was in a stable orbit, but the Doppler shift indicated the object was spiraling wildly, the brothers knew it was a lie. If the Soviets claimed a craft was unmanned, but the frequencies carried the unmistakable rhythm of a respiration cycle or a heartbeat, the brothers knew it was a lie. By 1960, Torre Bert had become a library of secrets. The shelves were lined with reels of magnetic tape. Each reel was labeled with a date, a time, and a frequency. Most of them contained static, cosmic noise, the background radiation of the universe, but some of them contained anomalies. We must pause here to consider the psychological state of these two young men. Imagine sitting in that bunker, night after night, headphones pressed tight against your ears. You are waiting for a sound from hundreds of miles above your head. You are the only witnesses to events that the most powerful governments on Earth are desperate to hide. It is a lonely, cold vigil. The first major anomaly occurred before Yuri Gagarin's famous flight. It was a signal that did not fit the pattern of a machine. It was biological. The specific nature of this biological signal is where the story shifts from technical history to modern horror. The brothers had modified their equipment to filter out the carrier waves, the loud hum of the transmission, to hear what was underneath. In November of 1960, months before the world celebrated the first man in space, the needles on their oscilloscopes began to jump in a rhythmic pattern: thump thump, thump dash thump. It was too slow to be a mouse. It was too fast to be a dog. The brothers, with their medical training, looked at the data. They looked at the graph paper spilling out of the machine. It was a human heart. Someone was up there, and they were terrified. The heart rate was elevated, spiking with adrenaline. This was not the calm, controlled pulse of a test pilot cruising in orbit. This was the pulse of someone who knew something had gone wrong. The brothers recorded every second of it. They listened as the signal grew weaker. They listened as the craft moved out of range. They waited for the Soviet news agency, TASS, to announce the launch. They waited for the celebration. But the radio from Moscow remained silent. There was no announcement. There was no parade. Just the static returning to the speakers at Torre Bert. This brings us to a chilling realization that anchors our story. If the Soviets never announced the launch, and the capsule never returned, then the man attached to that heartbeat is likely still up there. We must return to the science of the intercept to truly grasp the horror. It is easy to dismiss a sound as a ghost story, but it is impossible to dismiss the mathematics of the Doppler shift. The brothers at Torre Bert were not merely recording audio. They were recording velocity. In early 1961, just months after the heartbeat signal, another anomaly appeared on the brothers' equipment. This event is critical to understanding the legacy of Torre Bert. The official history books tell us that space travel was a series of orbital flights, circles around the Earth. A capsule launches, it spins around the planet. Gravity holds it in a low embrace, and then it returns. But on February 2, 1961, the Giudica Cordiglia brothers detected a transmission that broke the rules of orbital mechanics. It was a Morse code signal, weak, rhythmic, and persistent. The brothers tuned the dial, locking onto the frequency. They began to calculate the shift in the signal's pitch. If the object was in orbit, the pitch should have risen as it approached Italy and fallen as it passed over, repeating this cycle every 90 minutes. That is the heartbeat of a stable orbit: high, low, high, low. But the pitch of this signal did not cycle. It simply fell. It became deeper, lower, and fainter. Achille and Giovanni looked at each other in the cold light of the bunker. They ran the numbers again. They checked their calibration. The math was merciless. The object was not orbiting the Earth, it was moving away from the Earth. Consider the implication of this. In 1961, there was no technology capable of sending a man to the moon or to the planets. The rockets were designed for low Earth orbit. If a capsule was moving away from the Earth, it meant the retro-rockets, the engines designed to slow the craft down for re-entry, had fired in the wrong direction. Instead of slowing the capsule down to fall back home, they had accelerated it outward. The Morse code continued. It was an SOS 3 dots, 3 dots, 3 dots, the universal cry for help. But who were they signaling? The Soviet control center in Baikonur could do nothing. The Americans at NASA could do nothing. The capsule was drifting into the dark void between the Earth and the Moon, a tomb of aluminum and steel. The brothers at Torre Bert listened as the SOS signal grew fainter. Hour by hour, the signal degraded into the background static of the cosmos. They were the only people on the planet witnessing the slow, lonely death of a cosmonaut whose name we will never know. They recorded the silence that followed. That silence is heavy. It is recorded on the tapes at Torre Bert, a blank space where a human life used to be. This specific recording cemented the purpose of the listening station. It was no longer a hobby. It was a witness protection program for the truth. The brothers realized that the Soviet space program was reckless. In their race to beat the Americans, they were launching capsules that were not ready, with guidance systems that were flawed, and every time they failed, they simply closed the file and pretended the launch never happened. But Torre Bert became the uninvited auditor of these failures. The station itself began to evolve. The brothers added more sensitive receivers. They installed a large map of the world on the wall, using pins and string to track the phantom satellites. They began to sleep in shifts. The Cold War did not sleep, and neither did they. One brother monitored the frequencies while the other rested on a cot in the corner. The bunker became a capsule of its own, isolated from the world, floating in a sea of radio waves. Let us look closer at the physical evidence accumulated in this bunker. If you were to walk into Torre Bert in the mid-60s, you would see shelves bending under the weight of information. This was an analog world. There were no hard drives. There were reels of open-reel tape, miles of magnetic ribbon that physically held the vibrations of the past. The smell of the room was distinct heated dust, acetate tape, and stale coffee. The brothers were meticulous archivists. Every tape was logged. February 1961, unidentified signal. November 1960, respiration. These logs, written in handwritten Italian, are the only birth certificates and death certificates these lost cosmonauts ever received. The atmosphere in the station was one of quiet paranoia. The brothers knew that what they were doing was not technically illegal, but it was dangerous. They were intercepting the military secrets of a superpower. They were exposing the fallibility of the Soviet Union. There were times when strange cars were seen parked down the road from the tower. There were times when the telephone lines seemed to have clicks and echoes that weren't there before. The paranoia was part of the aesthetic. It fueled their obsession. They knew they had to be rigorous. They couldn't just claim to hear voices, they had to prove it. They began inviting other experts to the station, scientists, journalists, to verify their findings. They wanted witnesses to the witnesses. They wanted to ensure that if the KGB ever decided to silence Torre Bert, the tapes would already be public knowledge. The station became a fortress of data, and the data told a story of a desperate struggle for the stars. The brothers began to notice patterns in the Soviet transmissions. They learned the code words. They learned the specific frequencies used for voice versus telemetry. They learned the voice of the different spacecrafts. A Vostok capsule sounded different from a Sputnik satellite. A human voice sounded different from a recording. This expertise is what led them to the most controversial and terrifying discovery of all, which would occur just a few months later. But before we get to the nightmare of May 1961, we must understand the Gagarin paradox that the brothers uncovered. On April 12, 1961, the world stopped to celebrate Yuri Gagarin. He was the Golden Boy, the first man in space. He returned safely, smiling, a hero of the Soviet Union. The brothers at Torre Bert monitored his flight. They captured his signals. It was a perfect mission. Too perfect. Comparing the Gagarin tapes to their previous recordings of the heartbeat and the drifting SOS, the contrast was sickening. Gagarin's flight was calm. The telemetry was stable. The voice communications were clear and confident. It was a stark difference from the desperate, chaotic signals they had intercepted previously. This led to the chilling theory that defines the Torre Bert archive. Gagarin was not the first man in space. He was simply the first man to survive it. The others, the ones the brothers heard gasping for air, the ones drifting into the void, were the dress rehearsals. They were the expendable steps on the ladder that Gagarin climbed. The psychological burden of running the Torre Bert station cannot be overstated. Imagine being a 20-year-old student, holding the knowledge that a human being is slowly suffocating in a tin can above the atmosphere, and knowing that the entire world is applauding the safety of the space program. It creates a dissonance. A fracture in reality. The brothers became ghosts themselves in a way. They lived for the intercept. Their social lives faded. Their medical studies and engineering work became secondary to the archive. The station demanded their full attention. The static was a constant companion. Even when they were not wearing the headphones, they could hear the white noise of the universe, hiding the secrets of the dead. We must also consider the technology they built to pierce this veil of secrecy. The supreme antenna. This was their masterpiece. It was a massive rotatable mesh dish that they constructed by hand. In the photos from that era, the antenna looks like a piece of abstract art, a spiderweb of metal against the Italian Alps. But it was a precision instrument. It allowed them to track a capsule from the moment it rose over the horizon in the west until it set in the east. It was this antenna that allowed them to distinguish between a tape recording sent from space and a live human voice. The Soviets often sent unmanned capsules playing pre-recorded messages to test the radio systems. To an amateur listener, it sounded like a man in space. But the Judica-Cordiglia brothers analyzed the breathing patterns. A tape recording loops. A tape recording has a noise floor. A live human voice has variation. It has stress. It has fear. The brothers developed a methodology to filter the signal. They were forensic audio engineers before the term existed. They listened for the micro-tremors in a voice that indicated high G-force. When a cosmonaut is launching or re-entering, the GI force compresses the chest. It changes the vocal cords. You cannot fake that in a recording studio. You cannot fake the sound of a human being crushed by gravity. This is why the Torre Bert files are so disturbing. They capture the raw biology of spaceflight. The official recordings released by Moscow were sanitized. They were clear, heroic, and calm. The Torre Bert recordings were messy. They were filled with the roar of rocket boosters, the crackle of interference, and the undeniable sounds of human distress. As we close the file on the station itself and prepare to open the specific case files of the Lost Cosmonauts, we must acknowledge the legacy of Torre Bert. It stands as a monument to the truth that is hidden in the noise. The brothers proved that history is not just what is written down, it is what is caught in the air. The archive they created is a testament to the fact that you cannot hide a tragedy in the sky. Eventually, the signal comes down. Eventually, someone listens. The listening station at Torre Bert is now silent. The brothers have grown old. The equipment is gathering dust in museums or private collections. But the tapes remain. The magnetic particles on those reels are still aligned in the shape of the screams they recorded 60 years ago. We have established the location. We have established the method. We have established the credibility of the witnesses. Now we must listen to the tapes themselves. We must analyze the specific days when the sky turned into a graveyard. The existence of Torre Bert challenges our comfort. We like to believe that our governments are competent, that our heroes are safe, and that science is a clean progression of victories. The station proves otherwise. It proves that the path to the stars was paved with cover-ups. As we leave the physical space of the bunker, the cold concrete, the glowing tubes, the smell of ozone, we take with us the realization that the official narrative is merely a curated selection of facts. The truth is found in the discarded data. The truth is found in the static. The brothers of Torre Bert did not just record sound. They recorded the conscience of the space race. They forced the world to ask, what constitutes a successful mission? Is it the safe return of the pilot, or is it simply the ability to hide the wreckage effectively? The files we are about to open in the next chapter contain the most controversial recording in the history of the station. It is not a heartbeat, it is not a Morse code signal, it is a conversation between a woman and mission control, a conversation that ends in fire. The station is listening, the frequency is set, the tape is rolling. The Iron Curtain was not just a wall of concrete and barbed wire dividing Europe, it was a wall of silence. It was designed to keep people in, but more importantly, it was designed to keep the truth from getting out. Behind this curtain, an empire of shadows was conducting experiments that defied the laws of ethics and physics. The Soviet Union possessed the most advanced counterintelligence network in human history. They had the KGB, they had encrypted channels, they had the power to erase a human being from existence with a single phone call. Against this monolithic power, there were no armies, there were no spy planes, there were only two Italian students in a basement, Achillea and Giovanni. They had no security clearance, they had no government funding, all they had was scrap metal, copper wire, and an obsession with the invisible signals traveling through the cold night air. The file on them was stamped "Never opened" by intelligence agencies on both sides, because they proved a dangerous fact. that even the most secure empire cannot stop a radio wave. We begin tonight with the story of the Davids who listened to the Goliath and heard it stumble. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. Let yourself drift back to a time when the world was analog, a time of physical dials, glowing vacuum tubes, and the smell of ozone. Imagine the texture of the era. It is the late 1950s. The world is gray, divided into east and west. The air is heavy with the threat of nuclear winter. In Turin, Italy, the fog rolls down from the Alps, covering the city in a damp, cold blanket. It is a world of trench coats, low-brimmed hats, and whispered conversations in cafes. But while the rest of the world looked horizontally across borders, across walls, two brothers were looking vertically. They were looking up. The atmosphere in their workshop is thick. You can almost smell the solder melting. You can hear the scratch of a fountain pen on paper as frequencies are logged. There is a sense of quiet dread here, a feeling that they are trespassing on holy ground. They are stealing fire from the gods, and they are doing it with equipment they built by hand. To understand the magnitude of what happened at Torre Bert, we must first deconstruct the architects of this sonic intrusion. Achille and Giovanni were not your typical heroes. They were not trained in the spy schools of Langley or Moscow. They were products of post-war Europe, a continent rebuilding itself from the rubble. Achille, the older brother, was a student of cardiology. His mind was tuned to the rhythms of life, the pulse, the breath, the electrical signals that keep a human being alive. He understood the fragility of the body. He knew that, at high altitudes, the blood boils, the lungs collapse, and the heart struggles to pump against the crushing force of gravity. He brought a medical anxiety to the project. When they listened to the tapes, Achille was not listening for codes. He was listening for suffering. Giovanni, on the other hand, was the technician. He was the younger brother, a prodigy of electronics. In a time when a radio was a piece of furniture, Giovanni saw it as a weapon of truth. He understood that the Soviet Union could censor newspapers, they could censor television, they could burn books, but they could not censor the electromagnetic spectrum. The physics of radio are absolute. When a transmitter in Baikonur sends a signal to a capsule in orbit, that signal does not stop at the capsule. It continues. It bounces off the ionosphere, the layer of the atmosphere that acts like a mirror for radio waves. It reflects down to Earth, scattering across continents like invisible rain. Giovanni knew that if you built a bucket big enough, you could catch that rain. The brothers lived in a world of duality. By day, they were respectable students, attending lectures at the university, walking the cobbled streets of Turin. By night, they ascended to Torre Bert, their concrete sanctuary in the hills. This duality is central to the archive chill we feel when reviewing their case. It is the contrast between the mundane and the cosmic. They were fighting against the Iron Curtain, a term popularized by Winston Churchill. But for the brothers, the Iron Curtain was not a metaphor, it was a frequency jammer. The Soviets flooded the airwaves with noise to block Western broadcasts. Listening to the radio in Europe during the Cold War was like trying to hear a whisper in a storm. There was static. There was the woodpecker signaler, repetitive tapping sound used by Soviet over-the-horizon radar to disrupt communications. Navigating this auditory chaos required patience. It required a meditative state. The brothers would sit for hours, turning the heavy bakelite dials of their receivers by a fraction of a millimeter. Their hands moved with the precision of safe-crackers. Click hiss, click static. They were looking for the needle in the haystack. But unlike a needle, this target was moving at 17,000 miles per hour. The audacity of their operation is staggering. The KGB, the Soviet Committee for State Security, spent millions of rubles to secure their communications. They developed complex encryption keys. They rotated frequencies. They had thousands of agents dedicated to information security. And yet, two brothers in Italy, using surplus American military gear and scavenged parts from local scrapyards, managed to bypass it all. How? Because the Soviets made a critical error. They assumed no one was listening to the raw telemetry. They assumed that the West was only looking for military missiles, not the faint, encrypted biometrics of a dying cosmonaut. The brothers found the loophole in the Iron Curtain. They found the backdoor. The equipment they used deserves its own chapter in this archive of silence. They did not buy a listening station. They built it. They scavenged vast coils of copper wire. They climbed the roofs of abandoned buildings to retrieve metal mesh. They repurposed motors from old industrial machines to turn their antennas. The centerpiece of their arsenal was the Gelososo tape recorder. In the high-fidelity world of today, a tape recorder seems primitive. But in 1957, it was a time machine. It allowed them to capture a moment and replay it. This was their greatest weapon against the Soviet lie. The Soviets relied on the ephemeral nature of sound. A scream in space happens once, and then it is gone. It disappears into the vacuum. But if you record it, it lasts forever. The brothers modified their recorders. They changed the speed of the tape heads to capture higher frequencies. They built filters to strip away the cosmic noise, the radiation left over from the Big Bang to isolate the human voice. Imagine the tactile sensation of their work, the cold metal of the equipment chassis, the warmth of the vacuum tubes radiating heat in the damp bunker, the smell of acetate tape, the visual of the VU meters, the needles dancing in the red zone as a signal came through. This was a tactile, analog war against a digital, totalitarian secret. The Iron Curtain they were fighting was also psychological. The West was terrified of the Soviet space achievements. Every time a Soviet rocket launched, panic spread through Washington and London. The Soviets were seen as invincible technological giants. They were the masters of the future. But Achille and Giovanni saw behind the curtain. Through their headphones, they heard the fear and the voices of the cosmonaut. They heard the technical failures. They heard the frantic commands from ground control when a capsule began to spin out of control. They realized that the giant was stumbling. They realized that the Soviet space program was being held together by duct tape and propaganda. This knowledge was a burden. It isolated them. They couldn't talk to their friends about it. Oh, by the way, I heard a man die in space last night. It sounds like madness. It sounds like a conspiracy theory. So they kept to themselves. They became a secret society of two. The bunker at Torre Bert became their entire world. It was a concrete box floating in a sea of radio waves. Outside, the Italian economic miracle was happening. Fiats were rolling off the assembly lines. The cinema was booming. People were drinking espresso and discussing politics. But inside Torre Bert, the brothers were staring at a map of the world, moving pins across the Soviet Union, tracking the flight path of ghosts. They were against the Iron Curtain in the truest sense. They were piercing it. They were shining a flashlight into the dark corners of the Kremlin's secrets. And as we will see, the light they shone revealed things that were never meant to be seen by human eyes. To truly appreciate the scale of their achievement, we must descend into the technical details of their operation. This is where the story becomes a study in ingenuity. The brothers were operating in an era before the internet, before open source intelligence. If they needed a specific type of antenna, they couldn't order it. They had to invent it. The challenge was geometry. The Soviet Union covers a massive portion of the globe. To catch a signal from a craft launching from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, the brothers needed a line of sight. But radio waves, specifically shortwave frequencies, have a unique property. They skip. They bounce between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere. This skip distance varies depending on the time of day, the season, and the sunspot cycle. Giovanni, the engineer, memorized these cycles. He knew that at night, the ionosphere cools and rises, changing the angle of reflection. He knew that certain frequencies, 20 MHz, 40 MHz, were favored by the Soviet engineers because they could carry data over long distances with relatively low power. They built their first serious antenna array using a terrifyingly simple method. They went to a local scrap metal dealer in Turin. They bought aluminum tubing that was originally destined for plumbing. They bought copper wire by the kilogram. They dragged these materials up the winding roads to Torre Bert, constructing the supreme antenna. Their most famous listening tool was a feat of physical labor. It was a helical antenna, shaped like a corkscrew. This shape is crucial. Most antennas are linear. They pick up signals that are polarized either horizontally or vertically. But a spacecraft tumbles. As it spins in the void, its signal polarization rotates. A standard antenna would lose the signal every time the craft turned. The helical antenna, however, captures circularly polarized signals. It captures the signal no matter how the spacecraft is oriented. By building this, the brothers demonstrated a level of sophistication that matched NASA. They welded the joints by hand. They mixed concrete to pour the foundation. They rigged a motor system from an old industrial rotator so they could steer the antenna from inside the bunker. Imagine the sound of that motor. A low, grinding mechanical groan that echoed through the hills. Worklank, as the massive metal dish turned against the backdrop of the snowy Alps. It looked like a sci-fi listening post. But inside, it was just two young men in sweaters, drinking coffee to stay awake. The hacking of the Iron Curtain was not a digital hack. It was an analog hack. It required physical presence. The brothers set up a 24-hour watch. They knew that the Soviets preferred to launch in the early morning hours to maximize daylight for recovery crews in Kazakhstan. This meant that for Ak and Giovanni in Italy, the prime listening time was the middle of the night. The bunker became a sensory deprivation tank, broken only by the static, white noise, pink noise, the crackle of lightning storms over the Atlantic. They learned to identify the texture of the silence, and then the breakthrough. It started with the Sputnik signals, which were easy to catch, but soon they began hunting for the shadow frequencies. The Soviets had official channels for propaganda radio Moscow and secret channels for telemetry. The secret channels operated on sidebands, narrow slivers of the radio spectrum tucked away next to commercial broadcasts. The brothers modified their receivers to perform sideband injection. This is a technique where you inject a carrier signal into the receiver to make an unintelligible signal audible. It is like shining a black light on invisible ink. Suddenly, the hiss of static resolves into a tone. Beep, pause, beep, pause. It was a heartbeat. The realization that they had breached the Iron Curtain came with a wave of paranoia. If they could hear the Soviets, could the Soviets hear them? The brothers were not transmitting, they were only receiving. Passive interception. Theoretically, they were invisible. But in the world of espionage, paranoia is a survival mechanism. They began to notice odd occurrences. A black sedan parked at the bottom of the hill, idling for hours. Telephone calls to their family home where no one spoke on the other end, just the sound of breathing and a click. The Iron Curtain was not just a barrier, it was a beast that lashed out if you got too close. Yet, they continued. The thrill of the catch was too strong. They were assembling a puzzle that the rest of the world didn't even know existed. They created a log of anomalies. In this log, they recorded the mundane details that betrayed the truth. They noted that before a major launch, the background chatter on Soviet military frequencies would spike. The traffic analysis allowed them to predict launches before they happened, while the CIA was relying on you to spy plane photos that took days to develop. The brothers knew a launch was imminent because the radio chatter in Russia shifted from casual to frantic. They heard the Russian ground controllers testing their microphones. They heard the calibration tones. They heard the weather reports for the recovery zones. These were the breadcrumbs. The brothers followed them religiously. The Iron Curtain was designed to be opaque, but sound is transparent. The brothers realized that the Soviet space program was incredibly noisy. The rockets were noisy. The telemetry was noisy. The urgency was noisy. The urgency was noisy. One specific night illustrates their triumph against the secrecy. It was a cold night in late 1960. The wind was howling around the concrete corners of Torre Bert. The brothers were huddled over their Hallecrafters receivers, American-made radios, known for their sensitivity. The needles were bouncing. They picked up a signal that was drifting. It wasn't a clean sine wave, it was warbling. To the untrained ear, it sounded like interference, but Giovanni recognized the pattern. It was a tumbling signal. It meant a spacecraft had lost stabilization. It was spinning out of control. They recorded it. The tape spun reel to reel. The brown ribbon captured the magnetic footprint of a disaster. As they listened, they realized the signal was fading, not because the batteries were dying, but because the craft was moving away. It was leaving orbit. This was the moment the Iron Curtain fell for them. They realized the terrifying truth. The Soviets were losing control of their ships. The narrative of perfect socialist technology was a lie. The brothers were holding the proof in their hands. A plastic reel of tape that proved the Emperor had no clothes, and that the Emperor's astronauts were dying. Let us pause and visualize the archive they were building. The shelves were filling up. Each tape was a brick in the wall of evidence. They labeled them carefully. Mission unknown. Failed re-entry. Heartbeat. Irregular. The physical space of Torre Bert was becoming a mausoleum. The brothers were the caretakers. They felt a responsibility to these voices. If the Soviet Union wouldn't acknowledge these lost souls, the brothers would. They became the unauthorized guardians of the dead cosmonauts. This moral weight changed them. They grew up fast in that bunker. The playfulness of their early experiments vanished. The smiles and the photographs from this period are rare. They look tired. They look haunted. They look like men who have seen or rather heard too much. The technology they built, the supreme antenna, the modified receivers, the filters, was a marvel of amateur engineering. But it was also a curse. It connected them permanently to the tragedy unfolding above the atmosphere. They couldn't turn it off. Even when they went home, they wondered, who is screaming in the sky tonight? The game of cat and mouse played out in the invisible spectrum. The brothers were the mice, scurrying in the dark, picking up crumbs of information. The Soviet state was the cat, massive and predatory, But the mice had an advantage. They were small, and they were silent. We must consider the psychological landscape of the Iron Curtain era. This was a time when people disappeared. In the Eastern Bloc, merely tuning a radio to the BBC World Service could get you interrogated. What the brothers were doing, actively intercepting military telemetry, was technically an act of espionage. Even though they were in Italy, a NATO country, the reach of the KGB was long. Torre Bert sat isolated on a hill. It was defenseless. The door was a simple wooden frame. The windows were single-pane glass. If an agent wanted to enter and destroy the tapes, there was nothing to stop them. This vulnerability seeped into the recordings. When you listen to the brothers speaking, on the tapes, their own voices introducing a recording, you hear a tightness in their throats. They are whispering, as if the microphones could transmit their location. Back to Moscow. There were rumors in Turin. People whispered that the crazy brothers on the hill were working for the Americans. Others said they were communists working for the Russians. The truth was far more isolating. They were working for no one. They were independent observers of history. This independence made them dangerous to everyone. The Americans didn't trust them because they couldn't control them. The Soviets hated them because they couldn't silence them. The brothers began to take precautions. They made copies of the most sensitive tapes. They hid them in different locations. They developed a code for their logs. They treated the archive not as a hobby collection, but as evidence in a future trial that might never happen. The tension peaked when they decided to go public with their first findings. They knew that holding the secret was dangerous. If they disappeared, the secret would disappear with them. But if they shared it, if they put the story on the front page of a newspaper, they would have insurance. Fame would be their shield. They contacted the Italian press. They played the tapes for journalists. Imagine the scene: a smoke-filled newsroom in Turin, cynical reporters in suspenders, leaning in to listen to a grainy recording. Thump thump, thump thump. That Achille would say, pointing to the spinning reel, is a human heart in space. The reporters were skeptical. How do you know? How can two students do what the government cannot? Then Giovanni would show them the math, the Doppler shift calculations, the frequency logs, the undeniable logic of physics. The reporters would leave the bunker pale, shaken by the realization that the boys were telling the truth. The headlines broke: the mystery of the space signals. Italian students hear Soviet secrets. The Iron Curtain had been breached, not by a missile, but by a newspaper article. The Soviet reaction was predictable: silence, denial, TASS. The Soviet news agency issued brief statements calling the claims capitalist propaganda and bourgeois fantasies. They claimed their space program was flawless. They claimed every mission ended with a safe landing and a bouquet of flowers for the cosmonaut. But the brothers had the tapes, and the tapes didn't lie. This period of the story highlights the concept of gaslighting on a geopolitical scale. The entire Soviet apparatus was telling the world, you didn't see that, you didn't hear that. The Giudica Cordiglia brothers stood up and said, yes, we did. It is a classic archival thriller narrative. The small, uncomfortable truth versus the big, comfortable lie. The Tier 1 audience, sitting in the safety of the modern world, can feel the chill of that standoff. It is the archetype of the whistleblower. The brothers continued to upgrade their station. They knew the Soviets would change their frequencies to evade detection. It became an arms race. The Soviets moved to ultra-short waves. The brothers built new converters. The Soviets used but sending data in short, fast pulses. The brothers learned to slow down the tapes to decode it. There was a specific incident that underscores the danger. One night, while tracking a particularly active frequency, the power to Torre Bert was cut. The bunker plunged into darkness. The hum of the equipment died. The silence was sudden and absolute. Achille and Giovanni froze. Was it a power outage? A blown fuse? Or was someone outside? They sat in the dark for an hour, clutching heavy flashlights as weapons. They listened to the wind. Every creak of the building sounded like footsteps. Eventually, the power returned. It was likely a mundane grid failure. But in that hour of darkness, the reality of their situation crashed down on them. They were alone, they were vulnerable, and they were holding the smoking gun of the space race. This quiet dread is what makes the archive chill stories so effective for sleep. It is not a jump scare, it is a slow, creeping realization of fragility. It allows the listener to process the anxiety safely from their bed. The brothers' work against the Iron Curtain also revealed the tragedy of the Soviet scientists. Through their intercepts, they realized that the cosmonauts were often victims of rushed schedules. The politicians wanted a launch to coincide with a communist holiday. The engineers knew the rocket wasn't ready. The launch went ahead anyway. The brothers heard the result. They heard the technical breakdowns. They heard the confusion. In a way, Achille and Giovanni were the only ones who truly understood the sacrifice of the Soviet space program. They were the confessors for a secular religion that didn't believe in sin. As the 1960s progressed, the legend of the brothers grew. They became a paradox. They were celebrated in the West as geniuses, yet they remained outsiders. They were never fully embraced by the scientific establishment because their data was too raw, too controversial. They were the punks of the radio world. Their battle against the Iron Curtain proved that information wants to be free. You can build walls, you can jam frequencies, you can intimidate witnesses, but you cannot stop the signal. The physics of the universe are democratic. They work the same way for a general secretary in Moscow as they do for a medical student in Turin. The legacy of two brothers against the Iron Curtain is not just about space, it is about the power of observation. It teaches us that history is often happening right above our heads, unseen and unheard, until someone decides to look up. The brothers showed us that the official story is rarely the whole story. They peeled back the curtain and showed us the chaotic, messy, human reality behind the polished propaganda. They humanized the enemy. When they heard a cosmonaut crying, out in pain, they didn't hear a communist, they heard a human being. This empathy is the final key to their story. They didn't record these tapes to destroy the Soviet Union, they recorded them to remember the people the Union destroyed. As we close this file on the brothers' struggle against the geopolitical giant, we must prepare ourselves. We have established their methods, we have established their credibility. We have felt the cold draft of the Iron Curtain. But the darkest secret is yet to be played. The brothers had proven they could hear the heartbeat of a ghost. They had proven they could hear the SOS of the lost. But the archive holds one recording that stands above all others. It is the recording that has kept people awake for decades. It is the recording that the Soviets fought hardest to suppress. It is not a code. It is not a heartbeat. It is a voice. A woman's voice. The brothers are tuning the dials. The date is May, 1961. The static is clearing, and from the darkness of space, a voice is asking a question that haunts the archive to this day. Am I coming in? The answer, as we will discover in the next file, was silence. The most terrifying sound in human history was not an explosion. It was not a scream. It was a rhythm. In the vast, frozen vacuum of space, there is no air to carry sound. It is a domain of absolute silence, broken only by the electromagnetic hiss of the sun and the background radiation of the universe. But in late 1960, a signal pierced that silence. It traveled through the ionosphere, down through the clouds of northern Italy, and onto a magnetic tape at the Torre Bert listening station. It was a sound that should not have been there. It was wet. It was biological. It was the frantic, thumping percussion of a human heart fighting for survival. This file was never acknowledged by the Soviet Union. To them, the mission never happened. The capsule was empty. But the data tells a different story. The data shows a pulse rate of 140 beats per minute, spiking with adrenaline, then slowing, and slowing, until it stopped. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight with the anatomy of a ghost. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. Let us return to the bunker. The year is turning. The autumn leaves have rotted on the ground outside Torre Bert, and the first frost of winter is hardening the soil. Inside the concrete walls, the air is still. The smell is specific dust burning on the tubes of the radio receivers. Stale coffee, and the metallic temps of copper wire. Achille and Giovanni are there. They are wearing heavy wool sweaters. The heating in the bunker is primitive, and the stone walls hold the cold of the mountain. They are tired, their eyes are rimmed with red, the result of nights spent scanning the frequencies. The room is dimly lit by the orange glow of the vacuum tubes and the green trace of the oscilloscope. It is a temple of patience, a sanctuary of the spectrum. To understand the impact of the heartbeat recording, we must strip away the myth and look at the raw telemetry. We must place ourselves in the timeline. It is before Yuri Gagarin. The world is still waiting for the first man in space. The newspapers are speculating. The intelligence agencies are guessing, but the biology does not guess. The brothers had upgraded their equipment specifically for this kind of intercept. They had installed a new set of bandpass filters. In simple terms, these filters allowed them to cut away the static, the snow of the audio world, then focus on the narrow frequencies where data hides. On this particular night, the supreme antenna was pointed east. The motors had groaned into position, locking onto a trajectory that rose from the Soviet Union. The signal they caught was not a voice. It was not Morse code. It was a telemetry stream. Telemetry is the language of machines. It is a series of beeps and chirps that represent data, temperature, pressure, voltage. To the untrained ear, it sounds like a fax machine or a modem, but to the brothers, it was a language they were learning to speak. However, buried underneath the mechanical chirps, there was a secondary layer of modulation, a low-frequency thumping, thump-thump, thump-thump. Akili, the medical student, was the first to recognize it. He adjusted the gain on the amplifier. He pressed the headphones tighter against his ears, closing his eyes to shut out the visual world. He listened to the rhythm. In medicine, the heart is the engine of truth. You can lie with your voice. You can control your breathing, but you cannot command your heart to slow down when you are terrified. The heart reacts to the autonomic nervous system. It reacts to hypoxia, the lack of oxygen. It reacts to G-force. Akile looked at the second hand on the clock on the wall. He counted the beats. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rate was too fast. A resting human heart beats between 60 and 100 times per minute. A well-trained astronaut or pilot, sitting in a capsule, should be calm. Their pulse should be controlled. But this heart was racing. 140, 150. This was the physiology of panic. The brothers connected the audio output to a pen recorder, device that draws the sound waves onto a moving strip of paper. The pen jagged up and down, tracing the spikes of the heartbeat. The ink bled into the paper, creating a permanent visual record of a human life in distress. We must pause here to consider the implications of the heartbeat. Why would the Soviets transmit a heartbeat? The answer lies in the primitive nature of early space medicine. Soviet scientists were terrified of the effects of zero gravity on the human body. They didn't know if the heart would keep pumping without gravity to help it. They didn't know if the blood would pool in the brain or the legs. So they wired their cosmonauts with biometric sensors that transmitted the raw ECG, electrocardiogram data back to Earth in real. They needed to know if the pilot was alive. And because they needed to know, the Giudico Cordiglia brothers knew too. The signal was strong. This indicated that the craft was in low Earth orbit. It was passing directly overhead. The Doppler shift confirmed it. The signal was high-pitched as it approached Italy, and it deepened as it moved away towards the Atlantic. The physics were undeniable. There was a biological entity inside a metal sphere, approximately 200 miles above the surface of the Earth. But was it human? This is the question that skeptics have asked for decades. The Soviets had sent dogs into space. They had sent Lekar Belkacem. Was this just another dog? Akila argued against this. He analyzed the waveform. The heart of a dog is smaller. It beats faster. But the specific loop-dub sound, the closing of the valves, has a different acoustic signature. A dog's heart has a different variability. Furthermore, there was the context of the other signals. The brothers had detected breathing, heavy, labored, human breathing. A dog pants, a human gasps. The combination of the respiration rate and the heart rate convinced this was a person, and they were in trouble. The archive chill experience comes from the helplessness of the listener. Imagine sitting in that bunker. You are thousands of miles away. You cannot help. You cannot call them. You can only listen as the signal revolves around the Earth. Every 90 minutes the craft completes an orbit. Orbit 1, the heartbeat is fast, strong. Orbit 2, the signal returns. The heartbeat is erratic. Maybe an arrhythmia is setting in. Orbit 3, the signal is weaker. Is the transmitter failing, or is the heart failing? The brothers sat through the night, drinking cold coffee, waiting for the return of the signal. The silence between the orbits was heavy. It was a time of calculation. They checked their maps. They checked the propagation charts. They wondered if the capsule was overheating. In the early Vostok designs, the temperature control was a major problem. If the cooling system failed, the capsule would turn into an oven. As the temperature rose, the astronaut's heart rate would climb to compensate for the thermal stress. Eventually, heat stroke would set in, the brain would swell, consciousness would fade, and the heart would stop. The recording from that night captures this progression. It is a sonic documentation of a biological system shutting down. The listeners of the Tier 1 countries, safe in their beds, can visualize the isolation. The cosmonaut is the loneliest human being in existence. Below them, the world is asleep. Above them, the infinite black, and in their ears, the only sound is the hiss of oxygen and the thumping of their own heart, amplified by the helmet. The brothers at Torre Bert were the only ones holding a vigil. They were the priests at a funeral where the body would never be buried. We must examine the texture of the recording itself. If you listen to the original raw files from the Torre Bert archive, you hear more than just the heartbeat. You hear the texture of the Cold War. There is a layer of static that sounds like rain on a tin roof. There are sudden bursts of interference chirps and whistles caused by atmospheric storms or other military transmissions. The brothers had to filter this manually. Imagine Giovanni's hands on the dials. He is riding the gain, constantly adjusting the volume to keep the heartbeat audible above the noise floor. It is a delicate performance. If he turns the knob too far to the right, the static becomes a roar that drowns out the pulse. If he turns it too far to the left, the pulse disappears into the silence. He is mixing the sound of death as the night wore on. The heartbeat signal began to change. The rhythm became less distinct. In medical terms, the QRS complexer sharp spike of the electrical signal was widening. The heart was losing its voltage. The battery was running low. This brings us to the concept of the phantom cosmonaut. The Soviets denied this launch ever happened. According to the official records in Moscow, there was no rocket on the pad that week. There was no mission. So, who was the heart belonging to? Archival researchers have spent decades trying to match the Torre Bert recordings with the classified movements of Soviet personnel. Some theories point to a pilot named Alexis Ladovsky. Others mention Sergei. These names appear in fragmented intelligence reports and then vanish. They are the Lost Cosmonauts. The brothers wrote these names in their logs with question marks. They created a ledger of ghosts. The psychological toll of this specific recording was immense. Achille, as a doctor, was trained to save lives. He was trained to intervene. If a patient's heart rate spikes, you administer drugs. You apply oxygen. You take action. But here, the patient was beyond reach. The hospital room was traveling at 17,500 miles per hour. The impotence of the situation was crushing. Achille could only document the pathology of the end. Let us return to the signal for the third orbit. The brothers waited. The time calculated for the pass came and went. The signal was faint, barely audible. Thump. It was slower now. Bradycardia. The heart was giving up. The oxygen supply was likely exhausted. The carbon dioxide levels in the capsule were rising, creating a narcotic effect. The cosmonaut was likely unconscious, drifting into a sleep from which they would never wake. The sleep-friendly nature of this story lies in that drift. It is a dark comfort. The struggle was ending. The panic of the first orbit had given way to the lethargy of the final orbit. The universe was reclaiming the biology. The signal eventually faded into the background radiation. The brothers kept the tape rolling for another hour, just in case. But there was only static, the white noise of the cosmos. They labeled the reel Sconosciuto Battito Catito Cardiaco, unknown heartbeat. This recording is the centerpiece of the archive because it is purely visceral. It requires no translation. You do not need to speak Russian to understand the heartbeat. It is the universal language of life. And when it stops, it is the universal language of death. The existence of this tape challenges the official narrative of the space race as a glorious ascent. It suggests that the path to the stars was built on a foundation of trial and error, where the errors were human beings. The brothers stored this tape in a special section of their library. They knew it was volatile. If the Soviets knew they had a recording of a cosmonaut dying of heart failure, the consequences could be severe. It proved that the Vostok capsule was a death trap. It proved that the life support systems were not ready. In the years that followed, NASA would learn these lessons publicly. When Apollo 1 caught fire, the world saw it. When Apollo 13 exploded, the world prayed. The American failures were televised. The Soviet failures were encrypted. The Judica Cordiglia brothers were the decryptors. The technical analysis of the heartbeat tape continued for years. In the 1960s, the brothers played it for visiting scientists. In the 2000s, digital audio forensics experts analyzed it. They looked for the noise signature of the Soviet telemetry systems. They confirmed that the carrier wave, the radio frequency that carried the heartbeat, matched the exact fingerprint of the Soviet tracking ships. This was not a hoax. It was not a simulation. The archive chill feeling deepens when you realize that this signal is still out there. Radio waves travel forever. That heartbeat, transmitted in 1960, has now traveled over 60 light-years away from Earth. It has passed the stars of It is moving into deep space. The cosmonaut is dead, but the sound of their heart is still expanding into the galaxy. A ghost signal moving at the speed of light. Let us list the equipment used that night. It anchors the story in reality. The receiver was a Hallecrafters SX42, a heavy metal beast with a backlit dial. The tape was a standard quarter-inch acetate reel. The antenna was the helical array, tuned to 20.005 MHz. The room temperature was approximately 12 degrees Celsius. The time was roughly 2 a.m. Central European Time. These details matter. They take the horror and ground it in the mundane. It makes the story feel like a report, a dossier. This helps the Tier 1 audience relax. They are not being startled, they are being briefed. The brothers' reaction to the silence was characteristic. They didn't cry, they didn't panic. They simply stopped the tape, rewound it, and played it back. Thumping. They verified the data. They logged the time. They turned off the lights in the bunker and went back down the hill to the city of Turin. They went to their classes the next day. Achille studied the human heart in the anatomy lab. Giovanni studied circuits in the engineering hall. They carried the secret with them like a heavy stone in their pockets. The heartbeat signal serves as a prelude to the even darker recordings that would follow. It established that the brothers could hear inside the capsule. They weren't just tracking the metal shell. They were monitoring the passenger. This intimacy is what led to the obsession. They felt connected to these strangers. They felt a duty to listen, because if they stopped listening, the cosmonauts would truly be alone to fully grasp the anomaly of the heartbeat. We must place it side by side with the official history that followed. Months later, when Yuri Gagarin launched, the brothers recorded him too. The contrast between the two recordings is the smoking gun of the archive. When Gagarin flew, the telemetry was different. His heart rate was elevated at launch around 150 beats per minute, which is normal for a man sitting on top of a controlled explosion. But once he achieved orbit, his heart rate dropped. It settled into a rhythm of calm competence. It hovered around 70 or 80 beats per minute. He was joking with ground control. He was eating paste from a tube. He was observing the Earth. The heartbeat from the previous mission showed none of this stabilization. It stayed high. It stayed erratic. It showed a system both biological and mechanical that was under extreme duress. The brothers superimposed the graphs. Graph A, the heartbeat. Graph B. They did not match. Graph A was a jagged line of panic. Graph B was a smooth wave of control. This proved that the heartbeat was not a test. It was not a simulation. It was a failure. The Soviets often claimed that they sent mannequins into space, human-sized dolls with tape recorders to test the radio. But a mannequin does not have a variable heart rate. A tape recording of a heart beats at a perfect metronomic pace. It does not speed up when the retro rockets fail. It does not skip a beat when the oxygen drops. The variability in the Torre Bert signal was the proof of life. Let us delve into the cold case aspect of this. Why did the heart stop? There are three theories analyzed by the Archive Collective. Theory 1. Hypoxia. The oxygen system failed. The cosmonaut gently suffocated. This fits the slow deceleration of the heartbeat at the end of the tape. It is a relatively peaceful way to die. The vision narrows, the euphoria sets in, and the heart slowly stops. Theory 2. Overheating. The heat shield was damaged, or the cooling fans failed. The capsule became a sauna. The heart raced to cool the blood, but failed. This fits the initial tachycardia. Theory 3. The panic theory. The cosmonaut realized they were drifting away from Earth. The SOS signal, which we will discuss in the next file, suggests a navigational error. The sheer terror of looking out the porthole and seeing the Earth getting smaller instead of larger would cause the massive adrenal response heard on the tape. The listener can choose their theory. All of them end in silence. The archive chill atmosphere relies on this ambiguity. We give you the data. You build the nightmare. The brothers never claimed to know who it was. They only knew what it was. They treated the tape with reverence. In the chaotic library of Torre Bert, where tapes were sometimes piled on the floor, the heartbeat reel was always kept in a box. It was a relic. As the years passed, the tape began to degrade. Magnetic tape is organic in a way. It decays, the oxide sheds, the signal fades. The ghost was dying a second death. Giovanni realized this in the 1990s. He began the process of digitizing the archive. He transferred the analog screams into digital files. This act preserved the heartbeat for us tonight. The sound you imagine in your head, the thump-thump, is a digital echo of an analog recording of a biological event. It is a copy of a life. The boring history of the equipment preservation is vital here. The brothers had to maintain the original playback machines. A tape recorded on a Geloso recorder in 1960 plays back best on a Geloso recorder. The head alignment matters. The speed stability matters. They became curators of obsolete technology to save the obsolete history. If the machine breaks, the voice is lost. So the bunker became a museum of machines. The brothers would oil the gears. They would replace the rubber belts. They kept the machines alive so the machines could speak the names of the dead. The heartbeat signal is the bridge. It connects the silent, secret early tests to the loud, tragic failures that would come later. It was the warning bell that no one heard. If the West had heard this signal, really heard it and understood it, the space race might have looked different. It might have slowed down. But the West was listening for missiles, not men. The CIA was looking for telemetry that indicated weapon guidance systems. They dismissed the biological signals as medical tests or animal flights. They underestimated the Soviet disregard for individual human life. The Judico-Cordiglia brothers did not make that mistake. They knew that in the Soviet equation, X equaled a human being, and on that night in late 1960, they solved for X. As we close the file on the heartbeat, we are left with the residue of the sound. It echoes in the mind. It is a rhythm that reminds us of our own fragility. The Torre Bert station is quiet again. The tape has been put back in its box. The brothers have turned off the amplifier, but the story is not over. The heartbeat was a passive signal. It was involuntary. The cosmonaut did not choose to broadcast it. The sensors did it automatically. But what happens when the cosmonaut takes control? What happens when the passenger realizes they are lost and tries to reach out? The heartbeat proved there was life. The next recording proves there was consciousness. The brothers kept listening. They kept the antennas pointed at the void. And soon, the static brought them something new. Not a pulse, not a breath, but a message. A message sent in the universal code of distress. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. But this message had a terrifying characteristic. The Doppler shift was wrong. It wasn't orbiting. It wasn't coming home. It was moving away. But we leave the biological rhythm behind and enter the domain of the calculated cry for help. The file is marked SOS. The destination is unknown. The signal is fading. And we begin the next chapter with the most lonely sound ever generated by human hands. There is a speed limit to the universe. We call it the speed of light. But there is another speed that dictates the fate of every object launched from our planet. Escape velocity. To orbit the Earth, you must travel fast enough to fall around the curve of the world. But if you travel too fast, if your engines fire for just a few seconds too long, you do not fall. You break free. You leave the gravitational embrace of the Earth and enter the dark, infinite ocean of the solar system. On November 28, 1960, the Judico-Cordiglia brothers intercepted a signal that defied the logic of a safe return. It was not a voice. It was the frantic, rhythmic tapping of Morse code. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots, SOS, the universal cry for help. But the horror was not in the message itself. It was in the trajectory. The signal was not circling the Earth. It was fading. It was moving away. The file was stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight with the story of the capsule that accidentally became a star. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. Let us retreat into the safety of the archive. The bunker at Torre Bert is warm tonight. The tubes of the Hallicrafters receivers are glowing with a soft orange light, heating the damp air. Outside, the Milky Way stretches across the Italian sky, a river of white dust. Inside, the world is reduced to the movement of a needle on a gauge. Achille and Giovanni are sitting in their chairs, the leather cracked with age. They are drinking coffee that has gone cold. The smell of the room is a mixture of ozone, old paper, and the faint metallic scent of the recording tape. They are listening to the static. It is a hypnotic sound, the breathing of the ionosphere. Hiss, crackle, hiss. It is the sound of the world sleeping. But tonight, the static is hiding a tragedy. To understand the nightmare of the SOS signal, we must first understand the physics of the intercept. The brothers were masters of the Doppler shift. We have mentioned this term before, but for this file we must dissect it. Imagine a train coming towards you. The whistle sounds high-pitched, wee, as it passes you and moves away. The pitch drops, woo. This is the Doppler effect. Sound waves compress as they approach and stretch as they depart. The same principle applies to radio waves. When a satellite orbits the Earth, it approaches the listener, passes overhead, and then moves away. The radio frequency goes high, medium, low, then 90 minutes later it returns, high, medium, low. It is a cycle, a circle, but on this night, the brothers tuned their antennas to a distress frequency. They caught a signal that was weak, barely scratching the noise floor. It was Morse code. The tapping was manual. It wasn't a machine. It was a hand pressing a key. Giovanni locked onto the frequency. He watched he waited for the pitch to rise, indicating the craft was swinging back around the Earth. But the pitch didn't rise. It didn't cycle. It kept dropping. It went lower, and lower, and lower. The brothers checked their equipment. Was the receiver drifting? No, the calibration crystal was steady. Was the antenna misaligned? No, the supreme dish was tracking perfectly. The math left only one conclusion. The source of the signal was moving away from the Earth in a straight line. It was not in orbit. It was on a hyperbolic trajectory. Let us visualize the mechanics of this failure. A Vostok capsule is a simple sphere. To return to Earth it uses a retrorocket, a braking engine. The ship must be oriented correctly. If the ship is facing backward, the engine slows you down, and you drop into the atmosphere. But if the ship is facing forward, or if the guidance gyroscope fails and points the engine away from Earth, when you fire the rocket, you don't slow down. You speed up. You add velocity. You push the speedometer past 25,000 miles per hour. You break the chains of gravity. The brothers at Torre Bert were witnessing the first human voyage into deep space. But it was not a mission of exploration. It was a mission of no return. That the sheer loneliness of this signal is difficult to comprehend. The listener, safe in their bed, is anchored by gravity. You feel the weight of the blanket. You feel the mattress. You are held to the planet. The operator of that Morse key had no weight. They were floating in a tin can that was rapidly becoming a tomb. They were tapping SOS, but who could save them? The nearest rescue ship was on Earth, thousands of miles behind them. The physics of space travel are unforgiving. You cannot just turn around. You cannot make a U-turn in a vacuum without fuel. And the fuel was gone. It had been used to push them into the void. The brothers recorded the signal for hours. The rhythm was frantic at first, fast, desperate. Then, as the minutes turned into hours, the tapping slowed down. Imagine the psychology of the cosmonaut. They are looking out the porthole. They see the Earth. It is a beautiful blue marble, but it is getting smaller. It is shrinking. The moon is getting brighter, but it is cold and indifferent. The sun is unfiltered, burning with a harsh, radioactive light. The cosmonaut realizes the truth. They are not going home. They are going to drift forever. And yet, they keep tapping. Why? Because it is the only connection left. The Morse key is the only way to say, I am here. I exist. The signal from the SOS craft was moving through the radio spectrum. As the craft moved further away, the signal became weaker due to the inverse square law. This law states that as you double the distance, the signal strength drops to 1. The brothers had to strain to hear it. They turned the volume up to the maximum. The static roared in the bunker, sounding like a waterfall. But inside the waterfall, the faint beep 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 persisted. This recording is a favorite among the archive researchers because it represents the ultimate cold case. The body was never found because the body is still traveling. If the capsule is sealed, and the vacuum is perfect, the cosmonaut inside is perfectly preserved. They are frozen in time, mummified by the cold of space, still sitting at the controls, their finger hovering over the Morse key. The brothers logged the coordinates. They calculated the vector. Based on the position of the stars and the time of the intercept, the craft was heading out past the orbit of the moon. It would eventually enter a heliocentric orbit orbiting the sun. Technically, this cosmonaut became the first human planet, a tiny, metal planet with a population of 1. Let us focus on the specific act of listening. The brothers were not just passive observers. They were active participants in this vigil. The act of tracking a deep space object requires a meditative focus. Giovanni had to manually adjust the antenna. Every few minutes he would check the azimuth and elevation. Azimuth, 120 degrees. Elevation, 45 degrees. He would turn the heavy metal crank or engage the electric motor work-click. The antenna would shift a fraction of an inch against the night sky. Then he would return to the receiver, the Hallicrafter's SX42, a masterpiece of American engineering. He would check the band spread dial. This dial allowed him to fine-tune the frequency. The signal was drifting. As the craft moved away, the frequency shifted lower. Giovanni had to chase the signal down the dial. Imagine his hand, steady and calm, rotating the knob. He was following the cosmonaut into the dark. Achille was managing the tape recorder, the jealous OG-255. He was watching the tape supply. When one reel was about to run out, he had to be quick. He had to splice in a new reel or switch to a second machine to ensure not a single second of the SOS was lost. Click-clack, spool up. The mechanics of the bunker were rhythmic. The sound of the tape slapping against the heads, the hum of the fan cooling the transmitter. These sounds create a green noise environmental background texture that is perfect for concentration or for sleep. The Morse code itself deserves analysis. SOS 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. It is the simplest code to send. You don't need to be a skilled operator. You don't need to know the complex codes for navigation failure or oxygen leak. You just mash the key. But the brothers noticed something in the timing. The fist, the unique rhythm of the operator was changing. Early in the intercept, the dots were crisp. The dashes were long ddd, da-da-da-da-dee. It was authoritative. It sounded like a military pilot following protocol. But as the craft passed the 30,000-kilometer mark, the rhythm degraded. The dashes became shorter. The dots blurred together. Was it fatigue? Was it the onset of hypoxia? Or was it the realization that no one was answering? The brothers tried to calculate the speed of the craft. Based on the rate of the frequency drop, the object was traveling incredibly fast. Faster than 11 kilometers per second. At that speed, the Earth recedes quickly. The brothers had a globe in the bunker. They would look at it. They would look at the vast, empty space around it. They realized the scale of the tragedy. Space is mostly nothing. It is a void. And in that void, a single human heart was beating in time with the Morsky dot. The archive chill comes from the silence between the signals. Sometimes, the SOS would stop. The static would take over his. The brothers would hold their breath. Had the batteries died? Had the cosmonaut given up? Then beep beep beep. It would return fainter, weaker. But there, it was a stubborn refusal to die quietly. Let us speculate on the identity of the Soviets never released a name, but the timing is significant. Late 1960, this was a time of high pressure. The Americans were preparing the Mercury program. The Soviets needed a win. Intelligence reports from that era speak of a do-or-die atmosphere in the Soviet space program. Could this have been a test of a new long-range transmitter? Unlikely. Why send an S? Could it have been an unmanned probe? Probes send telemetry. They send data streams. They don't send the manual Morse code for save our souls. Machines do not have souls. Machines do not panic. That the brothers were convinced it was a man or a woman. The gender is impossible to determine from a telegraph key. But the fear is universal. As the night deepened, the signal drifted into the sidebands. The brothers had to use the BFO beat frequency oscillator to keep it audible. The BFO creates a tone that mixes with the incoming signal. It allows you to hear the It turned the radio wave into a mournful singing note, a high-pitched whine that rose and fell with the atmospheric distortion. To the brothers, it sounded like a ghost singing in the wires. The distance was now enormous. 50,000 kilometers, 60,000 kilometers. The craft was leaving the immediate neighborhood of Earth. It was crossing the invisible line where the Earth's gravity is no longer the dominant force. It was entering the gravity well of the sun. This is a profound threshold. Since the dawn of history, every human being who ever lived, died, and was buried, remained on Earth. This person was the first to leave the cradle forever. The brothers felt a strange sense of reverence. They stopped talking. They communicated only in gestures. Giovanni would point to the signal strength meter. It was dropping. Achille would nod and write the time in the logbook. 13:15. Signal fading. Readable but weak. 13:45. Signal intermittent. Heavy static. The boring history aspect here is the sheer duration of the event. It wasn't a quick explosion. It was a slow, agonizing drift. It took hours. This slow pacing mirrors the experience of falling asleep. The mind drifts. The thoughts become less coherent. The signal from the waking world gets weaker and weaker, just like the signal from the capsule. The brothers were the only witnesses to the funeral procession. The capsule was the hearse. The rocket engine was the horse. The vacuum was the grave. And the radio signal was the eulogy. Let's focus on the texture of the sound again. If you close your eyes, you can hear it. The base layer is the white noise, a constant, chic. This is the sound of electrons moving randomly in the circuits. On top of that, there is the crackle like bacon frying. This is static electricity in the atmosphere. And faintly, piercing through it all, the tone beat. The brothers had to filter this. They used notch filters. A notch filter is designed to remove a specific frequency, but they used it in reverse to remove everything except the frequency. They carved away the noise to reveal the truth. This technical dedication is what makes the Torre Bert archive so valuable. They treated the audio with the precision of diamond cutters. The existence of this SOS signal poses a question that history has tried to bury. What happened in the Kremlin when this signal was received? The Soviets had tracking ships. They had the Komarov and the Gagarin-class vessels stationed in the Atlantic and Pacific. They had massive radar arrays in the Soviet Union. They definitely heard the signal. They knew their pilot was drifting away. Imagine the conversation in mission control. The generals looking at the engineers. The engineers looking at their slide rules. Comrade General, the velocity is too high. The burn lasted 10 seconds too long. Can we bring him back? No, the physics forbid it. Then shut it down. Erase the tape. He does not exist. This is the cruelty of the archive chill. It is the bureaucratic erasure of life. To the state, the cosmonaut was a liability, a failure. But to the brothers, the cosmonaut was a human being screaming into the dark. By recording the signal, the brothers committed an act of defiance. They refused to let the erasure happen. They captured the ghost frequency. Let us analyze the what-if scenario. If the retro rockets had fired correctly, the capsule would have slowed down. It would have dropped into the atmosphere. The heat shield would have burned at 3000 degrees Fahrenheit. The plasma would have blocked the radio for a few minutes, the blackout period. Then the parachutes would have opened. The capsule would have landed in the snow of Siberia or the wheat fields of Kazakhstan. The recovery team would have arrived with vodka and blankets. The pilot would be a hero, but a single valve failed. A single electrical relay stuck, and instead of hero of the Soviet Union, the pilot became the lonely traveler. The margin between glory and oblivion is measured in millimeters. The brothers knew this. Achille, with his medical training, thought about the life support. How much oxygen was in a Vostok capsule? Officially, enough for 10 days. But that is assuming a normal metabolic rate. Panic burns oxygen. Fear burns oxygen. The cosmonaut likely had. The air scrubbers chemicals designed to remove carbon dioxide would saturate. The headache would start. Then the drowsiness. The SOS tapping would become slower, not just because of despair, but because the brain was shutting down. The signal intercepted by Torre Bert captures this decline. In the final hour of the recording, the Morse code is barely recognizable. It is no longer SOS, it is just ... long pause ... It is the sound of a mind unraveling. The brothers sat in silence. They didn't want to turn it off. To turn off the recorder felt like killing the cosmonaut themselves. They had to wait until the universe turned it off for them. Let us return to the boring history of the signal propagation. As the craft moved further away, the signal-to-noise ratio dropped below 1:1. This means the noise was louder than the signal. Only the most trained ear could hear it. Giovanni Giudico Cordiglia had that ear. He was a musician of the radio. He could hear the difference between a star and a satellite. He could hear the difference between a thunderstorm in the Alps and a thunderstorm on the sun. And he could hear the difference between a machine and a dying man. He noted in the log, signal entering deep fade, modulation loss. These technical terms mask the emotional reality. Modulation loss means the voice of the person is vanishing. The archive suggests that there may have been more than one drifter. There are rumors of a couple launched together. There are rumors of a woman who drifted away, which relates to our next file. But this specific SOS signal was distinct. It was solitary. It was one finger on one key. The brothers kept the original tapes in a climate-controlled box. Acetate tape is fragile. It can absorb moisture. It can grow mold. The brothers knew that these tapes were the only grave marker the cosmonaut would ever have. They preserved them not for fame, but for evidence. Evidence that we tried. Evidence that we failed. Evidence that the cost of the stars was paid in blood. The night passed. The Earth rotated. Torre Bert moved into the daylight side of the planet. The sun rose over the Alps, illuminating the snow, but the signal was coming from the dark. The brothers were exhausted. They had been awake for 24 hours, but they couldn't leave the post. The signal was now a whisper, a ghost of a whisper. Beep ... beep ... It was moving into the realm of the imagination. Was it still there, or were they imagining it? The brain seeks patterns in the noise. It is called pareidolia, but the oscilloscope doesn't imagine. The green line still jumped, ever so slightly, every time the signal hit. The machine confirmed the ghost. The end of the signal did not come with a bang. It came with a fade. It is like watching a ship sail over the horizon. You watch the mast, then the flag, then nothing. The SOS signal simply sank into the static. At 4 a.m., the brothers could no longer distinguish the Morse code from the background radiation of the galaxy. The supreme antenna was searching, but the target was too small, too far, and too weak. Giovanni took his hands off the dials. He leaned back in his chair. The room was filled only with the hiss of the empty sky. The cosmonaut was gone. Not dead not yet, but gone from the world of men. They were now a resident of the void. They would continue to drift. The capsule would eventually run out of power. The heat would dissipate. The capsule would freeze to near absolute zero. The body inside would not decay. There are no bacteria in space. There is no oxidation. The cosmonaut is likely still there today. 60 years later, perfect, frozen, waiting, floating in a silent orbit around the sun. A time capsule of 1960. The brothers turned off the recorder. Click. The reels stopped spinning. The silence in the bunker was louder than the static. They didn't speak. What was there to say? They had just attended the longest funeral in history. They logged the final entry. Signal lost. Target moving away. No return possible. They closed the logbook. They turned off the lights in Torre Bert. They walked out into the cold morning air of Italy. The birds were singing. The city of Turin was waking up. People were going to work. The world continued as if nothing had happened. But the brothers knew. The archive chill is the burden of knowing. It is the knowledge that, while we go about our daily lives, buying groceries, watching TV, sleeping, there is a metal sphere out there in the dark, carrying a frozen message from the past. This story challenges our perception of success. We celebrate the landings, we celebrate the footprints, but we forget the drift. The drift is the shadow of the flight. For every ship that comes home, there is a ghost story of one that didn't. The SOS signal is the most haunting file in the archive because it is unfinished. The message was never acknowledged. The help never came. It is an open loop, and open loops are perfect for the sleeping mind. They allow you to drift, just like the capsule, to float in the safety of your bed, while contemplating the infinite drift of the lost. But the brothers' work was not done. The sky was full of secrets. The SOS signal was a tragedy of physics. The next file we will open is a tragedy of a different kind. It involves a launch that was scrubbed from the history books, not because of an accident, but because of a lie. A launch where the pilot didn't drift away, but simply vanished before he even left the ground. The tapes are rewound. The file is selected. The next recording is queuing up. History is usually written in ink. It is recorded, filed, and remembered. But in the Soviet Union during the height of the space race, history was written in pencil. And pencils have erasers. We are taught that Yuri Gagarin was the first man in space on April 12, 1961. We are taught that his flight was perfect. But there are files in the Kremlin archives that were sealed for 50 years, files that tell a story of the launches that came before, the launches that failed. When a rocket exploded on the pad, it was not on the news. When a pilot was lost in the upper atmosphere, their family was told they died in a plane crash. But the most chilling technique was not the destruction of the rocket, but the destruction of the memory. Men were removed from official photographs. Their names were scratched out of ledgers. They became unpersons. The file was stamped, never open. Yet we begin tonight with the story of the ghosts who walked the earth, and then simply vanished into the air. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. Let us imagine we are sitting at a desk in a dimly lit room. On the desk is a photograph from 1960. It shows a group of 6 smiling young men in flight suits. They are the vanguard of the future. Now look at the same photograph published a year later. There are only 5 men. Where the 6th man stood, there is now a clumsy blur of airbrushed paint. A painted bush. A shadow that shouldn't be there. The smell of the room is chemical, the sharp scent of developing fluid and the dry dust of censorship. This is the office of Glavlet, the Soviet Bureau of Secrets. Here, reality is edited like a script. To understand the launch that never happened, we must first understand the intense pressure of the timeline. The year is 1960. The Americans are publicly testing their Mercury capsules. The world is watching Cape Canaveral. Every American failure is televised. When a Redstone rocket explodes, the whole world sees the fire. It is embarrassing, but it is transparent. In Moscow, the philosophy was different. The Soviet space program was a military operation. It was a state secret. Success was the only option. Failure was not just an engineering problem. It was a political crime. It was a sign of weakness in the communist system. So, a rule was established. A mission does not exist until it is successful. If a cosmonaut launches and orbits the Earth, TASS, the news agency, announces it with fanfare. If a cosmonaut launches and burns up on re-entry, TASS says nothing. The launch never happened. This created a phantom space program, a shadow program running parallel to the official one. The Giudica Cordiglia brothers at Torre Bert were the ones who noticed the discrepancies. They were tracking the shadow program. They would hear a launch sequence. They would hear the telemetry of a rocket rising. They would hear the separation of the stages. And then ... silence. No announcement from Moscow. No parade in Red Square. Just a hole in the calendar where a mission should have been. This brings us to the concept of the airbrushed cosmonaut. There is a famous photo of the Sochi 6, the top candidates for the first flight. In the original image, a man named Grigory Nelyubov is standing tall, handsome, smiling. He was a favorite. He was talented. But Nalubov made a mistake. He got into a drunken altercation with a military patrol. He was expelled from the program. In the West, he would have simply been fired. In the Soviet Union, he was erased. In subsequent publications of that photo, Nalubov is gone. The photo retouchers painted over him, but they were not perfect. If you look closely at the after photo, you can still see a floating hand resting on someone's shoulder, a ghost hand belonging to a man who no longer exists. This clumsiness is what makes the archive so terrifying. It shows the sheer effort the state put into lying. But Nalubov was erased for a behavioral issue. What about the men who were erased for dying? There is a persistent theory, supported by fragmented evidence, that Yuri Gagarin was not the first man in space. He was simply the first to survive and return publicly. The theory suggests that in the weeks before April 12, 1961, there was another attempt, a hurried, desperate attempt to beat the Americans. The brothers at Torre Bert recorded increased activity in early April. The traffic analysis showed the same patterns as a launch. The tracking ships were in position. The weather was cleared, and then, the radio chatter stopped abruptly. The ships returned to port. The signals ceased. Was there a launch? The official records say no. But in the diaries of General Nikolai Kaminin, the head of cosmonaut training, there are gaps. There are pages ripped out. There are cryptic references to accidents that required cleanup. Cleanup in the Soviet context does not mean sweeping the floor. It means removing the evidence. Imagine the physical reality of a failed launch in 1961. A Vostok capsule is a metal sphere. If the launch vehicle fails at high altitude, the sphere falls. If the parachutes fail, it impacts the ground at terminal velocity. There is very little left to bury. The recovery teams would arrive in helicopters. They would collect the debris. They would collect the remains. And then they would scour the area. Every bolt, every wire, every piece of the flight suit would be gathered. The impact crater would be filled in. Snow would be shoveled over the scar in the earth. Within 24 hours, the site would look like untouched wilderness. The launch never happened. This boring history of the cleanup procedure is hypnotic because of its efficiency. It is a bureaucratic magic trick. The family of the pilot would be visited by men in gray suits. They would be told that their son died in a training accident, a jet crash, a parachute failure during a jump. They would be given a pension. They would be given a medal. And they would be given a warning: do not ask questions. The silence was bought with fear and honor. The listener, lying in bed, can visualize this silence. It is a heavy blanket of snow covering the truth. The Giudica Cordiglia brothers tried to pierce this snow. They looked for the ghost launches. They noticed that sometimes a frequency would go active for 10 minutes, the exact duration of a powered ascent, and then cut to static. To an engineer, that profile looks like an explosion. The telemetry stream goes from system nominal to 0 in a microsecond. The brothers would log it. Possible launch failure. Signal loss at T+300 seconds. These logs are the tombstones for the unknown soldiers of the space race. We do not know their names. We do not know their faces. But we know they were there because the physics of the radio waves tells us something happened. Energy was expended, a signal was sent, and then, the state machine went to work to ensure that we would never know. Among all the rumors of phantom launches, one name rises above the rest. It is a name that was whispered in diplomatic circles and intelligence briefings in 1961. Vladimir Ilyich. He was not just a pilot. He was Soviet royalty. He was the son of Sergei Ilyushin, the famous aircraft designer who built the Ilyushin bombers and transport planes. Vladimir was a test pilot of supreme skill. He held altitude records. He was handsome, connected, and brave. He was the perfect candidate for the first man in space. And then, just days before Gagarin's flight, Vladimir Ilyushin vanished from public view. The official story, the one released months later, was that he had been in a car accident. A severe car accident that damaged his legs and required him to go to China for specialized medical treatment. Let us pause and analyze this boring history detail. Why China? The Soviet Union had some of the best trauma surgeons in the world. Why send a national hero, the son of a top designer, to China for leg surgery? And why did the photos of him after the accident show him looking not like a car crash victim, but like someone who had suffered extreme physical trauma consistent with a high G impact? The theory the launch that never happened goes like this. On April 7, 1961, 5 days before Gagarin, Vladimir Ilyushin was strapped into a Vostok capsule. The launch was successful. He achieved orbit. The Giudica Cordiglia brothers noted a heartbeat and Russian voice transmissions on this date. But something went wrong on the capsule malfunctioned. The guidance system failed. Instead of landing in the Soviet Union, the capsule overshot. It drifted thousands of miles off course. It came down in the People's Republic of China. At the time, relations between the Soviet Union and China were deteriorating. The Sino-Soviet split was beginning. For a Soviet cosmonaut to crash land in China was a geopolitical nightmare. According to the theory, Ilyushin was captured by the Chinese military. He was held in a hospital, not as a guest, but as a prisoner of intelligence. The Soviets could not admit this. They could not admit that their first man in space was a captive of a rival communist power. So, they scrubbed the launch. They erased the mission. They invented the car accident to explain his injuries and his presence in China, and then, 5 days later, they sent Yuri Gagarin's flight was shorter, it was simpler, and it landed perfectly in the Soviet Union. Gagarin became the face of success. Ilyushin became the face of the shadow. Is this true? The archive does not deal in certainties. It deals in probabilities. Vladimir Ilyushin eventually returned to the Soviet Union. He became a general. He never spoke publicly about the spaceflight. He lived the rest of his life carrying the official narrative. But there is a specific detail in the archive that haunts researchers. A journalist named Denis Ogden, operating in Moscow, reported the Ilyushin flight before Gagarin launched. How did he know? Was it a leak? Or was he seeing the preparations for a celebration that was suddenly cancelled? The archive chill here comes from the silence of Ilyushin himself. Imagine being the true first man in space. You saw the curve of the Earth. You saw the sun rise over the Pacific. You did it first. But you are forbidden from saying it. You have to watch another man wear the medals. You have to watch another man get the parades. You are a living ghost. You are walking through history. But you are not in history. The visual evidence of Ilyushin after 1961 is striking. He looks older. His eyes are hard. Researchers look at the photos of his car accident injuries. They analyze the scarring. Some aerospace medical experts suggest the injuries are consistent with a hard landing at crash where the retro rockets failed to fire, and the capsule hit the ground at 30 miles per hour. A car crash breaks bones. A capsule crash compresses the spine. Ilyushin had spinal compression. Let us return to the bunker at Torre Bert. The brothers had a recording from early April 1961. It was a voice. A Russian voice, calm but strained. It was checking oxygen levels. It was distinct from Gagarin's voice. Gagarin had a higher pitch, a more cheerful cadence. This voice was deeper, more serious. Was this The brothers labeled the tape the precursor. They knew that Gagarin was the performance, but this tape was the rehearsal. The story of the launch that never happened also involves the lost cosmonauts who died on the pad. There is the case of Valentin Bon. He was the youngest of the cosmonaut team, 24 years old. In March 1961, just weeks before the first flight, he was doing a test in an isolation chamber, a high-oxygen environment. He made a mistake. He dropped an alcohol-soaked cotton swab onto a hot plate. In a high-oxygen environment, fire behaves like an explosion. The chamber turned into an inferno instantly. Bondarenko could not get out. The pressure difference sealed the door. It took doctors minutes to open it. He was still alive, but barely. He whispered, "It is my fault. Do not blame anyone else." He died 8 hours later. What did the Soviet Union do? Did they give him a hero's funeral? Did they announce the tragedy to warn other scientists about the dangers of high-oxygen fires? No. They erased him. They airbrushed him out of the group photos. His existence was a state secret. The Americans did not know about the danger of high-oxygen environments. 6 years later, 3 American astronauts Grissom White and Chaffee burned to death in Apollo 1. It was the exact same accident. High oxygen, a spark, fire. If the Soviets had not erased Bondarenko, if the launch that never happened had been acknowledged, the Americans might have learned. Apollo 1 might have been saved. This is the deadly cost of the archive. Secrets do not just hide the past, they kill the future. The Bondarenko file was stamped never open until 1986 for 25 years. His family could not say how he died. The listener can feel the weight of this suppression. It is a cold, bureaucratic suffocation. It is the ultimate boring history, a history of filing cabinets, redaction pens, and silence. But inside those filing cabinets are the ashes of young men. Let us look at the documents themselves. The texture of a redacted file. In the archive, we often find pages where entire paragraphs are blacked out. The black bar, it is a visual representation of silence. But sometimes, if you hold the paper up to the light of a scanner, or the light of history, you can see the indentation of the typewriter keys underneath the ink. Researchers have done this. They have recovered the Namesay found the name Bondarenko under the black ink. They found the flight paths of rockets that didn't exist. The Giudico-Cordiglia brothers were doing the same thing with sound. They were holding the tape up to the light. They were recovering the acoustic indentations of the truth. The launch that never happened has a sound. It sounds like a carrier wave that suddenly cuts off. It sounds like a breathing pattern that stops. It sounds like the absence of a signal where a signal should be. If these launches never happened, where is the hardware? This is the final, lingering question of the file. Matter cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be rearranged. If a rocket launches and fails to return, the metal is still somewhere. The Archive Chill team has analyzed the debris catalogs of the US Space Surveillance Network. There are thousands of objects in low Earth orbit. Most are identified: spent booster, screw, paint fleck. But there are objects labeled unknown: Object 1961 Alpha, Object 1960 Beta. These are the ghost ships. They are the empty Vostok capsules, the upper stages of rockets that misfired. They are circling the Earth every 90 minutes. Silent monuments to the cover dash-up. Imagine looking up at the night sky. You see a star moving. It might be the International Space Station. It might be a weather satellite. Or it might be the tomb of a mission that officially does not exist. The metal is cold. It is pitted by micrometers. But if you could get close enough, if you could float alongside it and wipe away the space dust, you might see a serial number that corresponds to a production order in a Moscow factory in 1960. A production order that was marked cancelled. The existence of these artifacts makes the story tactile. It is not just a rumor. It is 2,000 kilograms of aluminum and steel flying over your head right now. The Soviet Union is gone. The Iron Curtain has fallen. The KGB is disbanded. But the ghost ships are still flying. They are immune to politics. They obey only gravity. The Giudico-Cordiglia brothers understood this permanence. They knew that even if they couldn't save the men, they could save the data. Their logbooks from Torre Bert are the only true history of this era. They recorded the failures that the world ignored. In doing so, they gave dignity back to the erased men. They said, "We heard you. We know you were there." As we prepare to close the file on the launch that never happened, we must acknowledge the psychological toll on the listener. It forces us to question the official narrative of all things. If they could hide a rocket launch, what else could they hide? If they could erase a man from a photograph, could they erase a man from history entirely? The archive is full of such questions. It is a labyrinth of forgotten truths. We have explored the heartbeat. We have explored the SOS. We have explored the phantom launch. But the most disturbing file is yet to come. It is the file that the brothers hesitated to release for decades. It is the file that contains the most visceral, human horror of the entire collection. It is not a man, it is a woman, and she is not just drifting, she is burning. The next recording is widely considered the most terrifying audio ever captured. It is the Giudico-Cordiglia final transmission. The woman in the capsule is talking to Mission Control. She is reporting heat. She is reporting flames. And Mission Control is saying nothing. The file is on the reel. The tape is threaded. The timestamp is May 1961. The launch that never happened was silent, but the next launch is screaming. The official history books tell us that Valentina Tereshkova was the first woman in space. Launched by the Soviet Union in 1963, she returned safely, a hero of the state. But there is a different voice preserved on the magnetic tapes of the Torre Bert archive, a voice that spoke 2 years earlier, a voice that did not return. In May 1961, the Giudico-Cordiglia brothers intercepted a transmission that has become the single most controversial audio file of the Cold War. It does not contain the triumphant words of an explorer. It contains the terrified questions of a woman being consumed by fire. The file was buried deep within the Soviet intelligence apparatus, classified as a non-event, erased from the timeline. But the radio waves did not obey the classification. The recording exists. It captures the final moments of a human being facing the absolute heat of re-entry failure. The file was stamped, "Never open," yet we begin tonight with the story of the woman who burned on the way down. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. Imagine the physical spool of tape. It is brown, brittle, and smells of vinegar, the scent of acetate decay. It is sitting on a metal shelf in a climate-controlled room. It looks innocent. It looks like any other reel of music or dictation. But if you load it onto the machine, if you thread the leader tape through the guides and press play, the room fills with the sound of a nightmare. The static is harsh. The interference is heavy. But cutting through the noise is a voice that sounds incredibly close, yet impossibly far away. Let us transport ourselves back to the bunker. It is late May, 1961. The air in Italy is turning warm, but the brothers are freezing in the basement, paralyzed by what they are hearing. To understand why this recording is so disturbing, we must place it in the context of the space race. It had been only 1 month since Yuri Gagarin's flight. The Soviet Union was riding a wave of euphoria. They had proven they could put a man in space. Now, they wanted to prove they could do something even more impressive, a multi-day mission, or perhaps a rendezvous. The intelligence gathered by the brothers suggested that a new launch had occurred around May 16, 1961. The signals were there, the tracking ships were active, but this time, the voice on the frequency was different. The brothers were used to hearing male voices, deep, baritone Russian voices speaking in military code, but on this night the voice was higher. It was female. Achille and Giovanni checked their receivers. They adjusted the fine-tune. There was no mistake. A woman was in orbit. This was 2 years before the world would ever hear the name Valentina Tereshkova. This unknown cosmonaut was alone, and based on the telemetry, she was in trouble. The recording we are analyzing tonight is not a long, coherent speech. It is a fragmented, desperate dialogue with mission control. The listeners in the Tier 1 nations must understand the boring history of radio translation to appreciate the horror. The Russian language is dense. When spoken quickly, under extreme stress, it becomes difficult to decode. The brothers spent years analyzing this tape. They hired translators. They broke down the phonemes. The translation reveals a situation that is deteriorating rapidly. The recording begins with the cosmonaut complaining about the heat. Listen, listen, come in, come in, talk to me. Her voice is strained. In medical terms, we can hear the tachypnea breathing. She is not just hot, she is overheating. A Vostok capsule is essentially a thermos bottle. If the cooling system fails, the body heat of the occupant and the heat from the electronics have nowhere to go. The temperature rises slowly, then exponentially. The brothers noted that the signal was wobbling. This indicates the craft was tumbling. A tumbling spacecraft is a death sentence during The heat shield, a thick layer of ablative material, is located on the bottom of the capsule. It is designed to face the wind of the atmosphere. It burns away, protecting the pilot. If the craft is spinning, the heat shield is not facing the heat. The exposed metal sides of the capsule are facing the heat. Aluminum melts at 660 degrees Celsius. The plasma surrounding a re-entering spacecraft reaches 3000 degrees. The archive chill comes from the realization that the cosmonaut knows exactly what is happening. She is not confused. She is a pilot. She knows the physics. She knows that if she cannot stabilize the ship, she will burn. And she is asking mission control for instructions. What? I am hot. I am hot. Come in. What? What? She is likely reading out temperatures, or perhaps oxygen levels. The numbers are climbing. The silence from the other end is deafening. On the tape, we hear only her voice. The ground station's replies are on a different frequency. Or perhaps they are too weak to be picked up by the brothers in Italy. This creates a one-sided conversation with death. We hear the plea, but we do not hear the answer. Or perhaps there was no answer. Perhaps mission control, realizing the mission was lost, had already cut the link to maintain plausible deniability. To leave her alone in the dark, the brothers monitored the signal as the craft began its descent. Usually, this is the blackout period. The plasma sheath blocks radio waves, but if the angle is wrong, or if the craft is breaking up, signals can leak through. The transmission became erratic, bursts of static. And then, the most chilling phrases: I see a flame, I see a flame, I feel hot, I feel hot, am I crashing? Yes, I am hot. The emotion in these words transcends language barriers. You do not need to speak Russian to understand the cadence of terror. It is the sound of a human being realizing that the vehicle designed to protect them has become an oven. The brothers at Torre Bert were paralyzed. They had heard the heartbeat. They had heard the SOS, but this was different. This was visceral pain. The recording ends not with a fade-out, but with a disintegration. The voice screams. The sentence is cut off. And then, raw noise. The kind of noise that happens when a transmitter melts. We must now navigate the labyrinth of truth and denial surrounding this tape. This specific recording is the most contested piece of evidence in the Torre Bert archive. Skeptics have attacked it for decades. They claim the Russian is grammatically incorrect. They claim the technical details don't match Vostok protocols. But we must look at the counter-evidence. We must look at the Ludmila theory. In the shadows of the Soviet space program, there are whispers of a cosmonaut named Ludmila. Her last name is lost to history. The theory suggests she was part of the initial selection. Why would the Soviets launch a woman in 1961? For the same reason they did everything: propaganda. They wanted to show that under communism, men and women were equal. They wanted to claim the first woman in space title before the Americans even launched a man. It was a high-risk, high-reward gamble. If Ludmila had succeeded, she would be as famous as Gaga. Statues would be built of her. Schools would be named after her. But she failed. And in the cold logic of the Kremlin, a failed hero is worse than no hero at all. A woman burning to death in a Soviet capsule would be a PR disaster. It would make the Soviet technology look barbaric. So, the eraser was used. The brothers named this file the Tower Woman. The name itself is evocative. A woman trapped in a tower of metal, high above the earth. The controversy over the translation is fascinating. Some linguists argue that the phrases "I am hot" carry a double meaning. In Russian, specific phrasing can indicate emotional distress versus physical temperature. The brothers stood by their translation. They argued that the panic in the voice overrides grammatical precision. When you are burning, you do not worry about correct syntax. Let us analyze the re-entry corridor. To return from space, you must hit a narrow window in the atmosphere. If you come in too shallow, you skip off the atmosphere like a stone on a pond and drift into space forever, as we saw in the SOS file. If you come in too steep, you burn up. The deceleration G-forces crush you, and the heat shield cannot handle the load. The recording suggests a steep entry. The craft was diving. This explains the intense heat. It explains the flames she saw. Usually, a cosmonaut cannot see the flames because the windows are covered by shutters or the plasma is too bright. But if she saw flames inside the cabin, that means the hull had been breached. That means the atmosphere was entering the ship. That the boring history of structural failure is terrifying. The aluminum skin of the capsule would soften. The seals around the hatch would fail. The air inside would instantly superheat. The recording captures the moment the environment inside the ship transitioned from habitable to lethal. The listeners in the Tier 1 demographic, safe in their climate-controlled homes, can meditate on this fragility. We are biological organisms designed for a very specific temperature range. A few degrees up or down, and we die. Space travel pushes us to the edge of that envelope. The Tower Woman was pushed outside of it. The aftermath of this recording at Torre Bert was profound. The brothers were accused of faking it. The Soviet press called them gangsters of the airwaves. But why would two Italian students fake a recording of a woman dying? They had nothing to gain but trouble. They risked their reputations. They risked legal action. They released the tape because they believed it was a moral obligation. They believed that even if the Soviet Union wouldn't acknowledge her, the world should hear her voice. There is a specific detail in the audio that audio forensics experts point to. The noise floor beneath the voice. There is a specific mechanical whine. It matches the frequency of the Vostok inverters, the devices that convert battery power to a C current. This sound is a fingerprint. It is very difficult to forge. It suggests that the recording was made from a real spacecraft, regardless of who was inside. Let us consider the silence that followed. After the static took over, the frequency went dead. The brothers kept listening, orbit after orbit, but the signal never returned. This confirms the destructive re-entry theory. The craft did not stay in orbit. It did not land. It vaporized. The debris would have scattered over the Pacific Ocean or Siberia, small pieces of melted metal falling like rain. There was no body to recover, no funeral to hold. She simply ceased to be. This total annihilation is the ultimate form of archive chill. It is the erasure of the physical self. It allowed the Soviet state to claim she never existed. We have no record of a female cosmonaut. All our launches are successful. The Italian brothers are lying. It is the perfect crime. The evidence burned up in the atmosphere. Only the magnetic tape remained. The recording of May 1961 stands as the grim monolith of the Torre Bert collection. It is the file that everyone wants to hear, but no one wants to believe. It forces us to confront the cost of progress. Every rocket that launches today stands on the shoulders of these failures. Safety protocols are written in blood. The Tower Woman died so that future engineers would learn to build better heat shields. She died so that future mission controllers would learn that silence is not an option. But because her death was classified, the lesson was delayed. The West didn't learn from it immediately. It remained a rumor, a ghost story told by engineers in bars. Did you hear about the woman who burned? No, that's just a myth. But the tape spins. The voice speaks. The myth becomes reality. As we store this reel back in its box, we must handle it with care. It contains the last breath of a pioneer. Whether her name was Ludmila or Maria, or something else, she was an explorer. She sat on top of a rocket. She looked at the Earth from space. She saw the sun rise and set every 90 minutes. She was brave, and she was betrayed by the technology she trusted. But the archive chill is not just about fear. It is about memory. By listening to this tape tonight, we are remembering her. We are breaking the classification order. We are opening the file that was stamped never open. We are witnessing the witness. The Giudica Cordiglia brothers are old men now, or have passed on, but their legacy is this library of sound. They proved that the truth cannot be incinerated. It can be caught. It can be recorded. It can be replayed. This concludes the case file of the Lost Cosmonauts. We have heard the heartbeat. We have heard the SOS. We have heard the launch that never happened. And finally, we have heard the fire. These are the sounds of the boring history that keeps us awake. The history that is not in the textbooks. The history that drifts in the static between the stations. As you drift off to sleep tonight, listen to the silence of your room. Be thankful for the gravity that holds you. Be thankful for the air that surrounds you. And remember the voices in the dark who drifted so we could fly. There are billions of words recorded in the history of humanity. Speeches, declarations of war, poems of love. But there is one sentence, captured on a crumbling magnetic tape in 1961, that outweighs them all in sheer visceral horror. It is not a poetic sentence. It is a biological fact, screamed into a radio microphone while falling from the sky. I am burning. These 3 words dismantle the glory of the space race. They strip away the medals, the flags, and the propaganda. They leave only the raw, terrifying reality of a human body trapped inside a falling star. The file containing this translation was stamped never open, locked in a vault of silence for decades. But the signal leaked out. And tonight, we begin the autopsy of that signal. We will slow it down. We will analyze the breath. We will witness the moment the fire breached the hull. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. Let us put on the headphones. The foam is cracked with age. The cord is coiled. When you press play on the Torre Bert final transmission, you are not just hearing sound. You are hearing heat. The static sounds like crackling wood. The interference sounds like flames licking the edges of the atmosphere. The voice is distorted by the Doppler shift and the violence of the vibration. It cuts through the green noise of the bunker like a knife. We are no longer in the modern world. We are inside the capsule. The temperature is rising. The windows are glowing red. And there is no way out to understand the gravity of I am burning. We must perform a forensic linguistic analysis of the tape. The Giudica Cordiglia brothers did not speak fluent Russian initially. They had to transcribe the sounds phonetically. They wrote down the sounds as they heard them, then took them to a translator. Imagine the scene. The translator looks at the paper. His face goes pale. He looks at the brothers. Where did you get this? He asks. From the radio, they reply. This is not a test, the translator says. This person is dying. Let us go through the transcript, line by line. The recording begins with numbers, 5.4.3. Skeptics argue this is a countdown, but in the context of the distress, it is more likely a readout of oxygen levels or temperature gauges. Then the confusion sets in. Isn't this dangerous? Talk to me. Our transmission begins now. The voice is female. It is high-pitched, tight with adrenaline. The vocal cords are constricted. This is the physiological response to extreme fear. The body is diverting blood to the muscles, preparing for a fight that cannot be fought. I feel hot. I feel hot. This repetition is crucial. In a normal re-entry, the cosmonaut feels Jeffers' pressure on the chest. They might feel warm, but the cooling system keeps the cabin at a survivable temperature. To say I feel hot implies that the ambient air temperature inside the suit has exceeded safety limits. The air conditioning has failed. The heat shield is transferring thermal energy into the titanium shell of the craft. The Vostok is turning into an oven. I see a flame. I see a flame. This is the turning point of the recording. This is the anomaly. As we discussed in the previous file, the plasma sheath outside the window glows bright orange or white. It looks like fire, but it is technically ionized gas. However, the Russian phrase she uses suggests she is seeing flames breaching something. If a seal fells a rubber gasket around the hatch, or a seal around the window, the plasma enters the cabin. Plasma at 3000 degrees Celsius acts like a blowtorch. It cuts through metal instantly. When she says I see a flame, she is likely witnessing the physical disintegration of her ship from the inside. Am I crashing? Why ease? Yes. I am hot. The resignation in this question is heartbreaking. Am I crashing? She knows the answer. The telemetry knows the answer. The gyroscope has tumbled. The angle of attack is wrong. Instead of skipping off the atmosphere to slow down, she is digging into it too fast. The friction is too high. The yes, yes, is perhaps her answering her own question. Or perhaps it is a final realization of her fate. The transmission ends with a scream. It is not a Hollywood scream. It is a short, sharp intake of breath followed by a chaotic noise. The transmitter melts. The microphone melts. The tape goes to static. Let us analyze the boring history of the heat itself. Re-entry heating is caused by compression. The spacecraft moves so fast, 25 times the speed of sound, that the air molecules in front of it cannot get out of the way. They are crushed together. This compression creates a shockwave of immense energy. The heat shield is made of a resin-impregnated material designed to burn away slowly. This is called ablation. It carries the heat away with the peeling layers. But if the craft spins, the heat hits the unprotected rear section, the equipment module, the antennas. The antennas are the first to go. This is why the signal cuts out. We are listening to the exact millisecond where the laws of physics overwhelm the durability of the machine. The archive chill here is the proximity. This woman was in low Earth orbit. She was passing over Europe. She was physically close to the brothers in Italy, maybe only 100 miles up. They could almost look up and see the streak of light in the sky, a shooting star that contained a person. The psychological impact on the listener is one of claustrophobia. Most nightmares involve being trapped. A space capsule is the ultimate trap. It is a sphere of metal, 2 meters wide. You are strapped into an ejection seat. You are wearing a bulky pressure suit. You cannot move. You cannot open the window. You can only watch the gauge climb. 30 degrees, 40 degrees, 50 degrees. The sweat boils off your skin. The air burns your lungs. I am burning. It is a statement of fact. It is the most honest sentence ever spoken in space. The official Soviet reports speak of glory, socialism, and triumph, but the archive speaks of heat. The truth is not in the ideology, it is in the temperature. We must also analyze the other side of this conversation, the silence. A radio transmission is a loop, a sender and a receiver. Throughout the recording, the cosmonaut is begging for a response. Come in, talk to me. Why did mission control not answer? There are 2 possibilities preserved in the archive. Possibility 1, the physics of the plasma blackout. As we mentioned, the ionized gas around the ship blocks radio waves. It is possible that ground control literally could not hear her. To them, her screen was blank. Her voice was gone. She was screaming into a void that had already closed. This creates a tragedy of isolation. She thought they were ignoring her, but in reality, they were deaf. Possibility 2, the intentional silence. This is the darker theory, favored by Cold War historians. The Soviet space program was run by the military. Secrecy was paramount. If they knew the mission was a failure, if the telemetry showed the heat shield was compromised hours ago, they might have cut the feed. Why speak to a corpse? Why record a failure? Cutting the link allows them to claim the mission never existed. We lost contact. The orbit degraded. It turns a human tragedy into a technical glitch. If this is true, then the woman in the capsule was not just killed by physics. She was killed by bureaucracy. She was abandoned before she even died. The archive chill is the coldness of that decision. The men in the bunker in Moscow drinking tea, watching the blip on the radar disappear, and then simply turning off the lights. Let us return to the boring history of the equipment that captured this. The Giudico Cordiglia brothers were using a dipole antenna for this intercept. The signal was strong. This indicates she was low. The slant range, the distance between the transmitter and the receiver, was decreasing rapidly. This confirms the crash trajectory. She wasn't drifting away like the SOS signal. She was falling in. She was coming down in Europe. That there were reports of a fireball seen over the skies of Italy and France in May 1961. Astronomers dismissed it as a meteorite. But meteorites do not scream in Russian. The debris field would have been vast. If a capsule breaks up at Mach 20, it shreds into confetti, titanium, steel, copper, flesh, all of it vaporized or scattered over the Alps. This is why there is no grave. The atmosphere itself is the grave. The particles of that ship are still floating in the upper stratosphere. When you see a beautiful sunset, caused by dust in the high atmosphere, you are looking at the remnants of history. That legacy of iron burning is its refusal to be silenced. The Soviets erased the paperwork. They erased the photos. But they forgot to erase the radio waves. The brothers caught the echo. And now, 60 years later, that echo is playing in your ear. It is a ghost story, but the ghost is not supernatural. The ghost is electromagnetic. The Tier 1 audience, accustomed to safety warnings and guarded rails, finds a strange comfort in this raw danger. It reminds us of a time when exploration was not safe, when the map had dragons at the edges. The woman in the tower was a dragon rider who fell. The tape ends. The static returns. The brothers sit in the bunker at Torre Bert. They do not speak. They write in the logbook. Signal lost. Impact confirmed. They turn off the recorder, but the sound remains in their heads. I am burning. It is a sentence that cannot be heard. As we close the file on the nightmare recording, we are left with a vacuum. We have explored the noise of the crash, but what happens after the crash? What happens when the dust settles and the silence returns? The Soviet machine did not stop. It did not mourn. It simply moved to the next launch. The next file in our archive explores the eerie silence that follows a disaster, the method of cleaning up, the method of forgetting, the method of pretending that the sky is empty when we know it is full of ghosts. The fire is out, the capsule is gone, but the cover-up is just beginning. We must now look at how they hid the ashes. The loudest sound in the world is not an explosion, it is the silence that follows it. When a rocket fails, there is a moment of chaos. There is fire, there is debris, there is the screaming of metal tearing apart at hypersonic speeds. But eventually, the physics settle, the debris falls to the earth, the fire burns out, and then, a new kind of machinery takes over, not the machinery of engineering, but the machinery of the state. In May 1961, after the transmission of the burning woman ended, the Soviet Union did not mobilize rescue teams. They mobilized silence. They deployed a suppression grid that was more sophisticated than their guidance systems. The crash site was scrubbed. The records were burned. The frequency was jammed. The file was stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight with the anatomy of the cover-up. We will explore how a superpower makes a human being disappear into thin air. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. Let us visualize the landing site. It is not a designated zone. It is a random patch of forest in Siberia, or perhaps a stretch of cold water in the Pacific. The snow is disturbed. There is a crater, steaming in the cold morning air. Smell the air. It smells of hydrazine fuel and scorched pine trees. But there are no cameras here. There are no reporters. There are only men in heavy coats arriving in unmarked helicopters, carrying shovels and bags. They are not here to save a life. They are here to erase a mistake, to understand the silence after the crash. We must look at the standard operating procedure of the Soviet space program. Every mission had two prepared statements sitting on the desk of the TASS news agency director. Statement A. A glorious victory for the Soviet Union. The mission is a success. Statement B. A tragic accident has occurred. But for the Lost Cosmonauts, the ones whose missions were never announced before launch, there was a third option. Statement C. Silence. If the public didn't know the rocket had launched, they didn't need to know it had crashed. The paper containing the launch order was simply shredded. The silence was not passive, it was active. It required work. Let us return to the brothers at Torre Bert. The recording of the woman ended in static. Achille and Giovanni waited. They kept the tape rolling. Usually, after a mission ends, there is chatter. The recovery teams radio back to base, capsule located, pilot safe. But on that night in May, there was nothing. The green noise of the atmosphere filled the room. This silence was heavier than the scream. It was a confirmation of death. The brothers monitored the Soviet news frequencies. Radio Moscow was playing classical music. They were broadcasting reports about tractor production and harvest yields. The dissonance was terrifying. In the sky, a woman had just burned to death. On the radio, a symphony was playing. This is the essence of the archive chill. It is the gap between reality and the official narrative. The listener lying in the safety of their bed can feel the weight of this gap. Imagine knowing a secret that the entire world is denying. The brothers were the only mourners at the funeral. Let us analyze the physical cleanup. The debris field of a re-entry failure is vast. If the tower woman broke up over Europe, small pieces of the Vostok would have rained down over hundreds of miles. Most of it would look like space junk, unrecognizable lumps of melted slag. But the larger pieces, the heavy engines, the spherical hull would impact the ground. The Soviet recovery teams were efficient. They tracked the radar signature of the debris. They would cordon off the area. Military exercise. Restricted zone. Farmers who saw the fireball were told it was a meteorite or a weather balloon test. They were told to forget it. And in the Soviet Union of 1961, when a man in a uniform told you to forget something, you forgot it. The silence extended to the families. This is the most boring yet heartbreaking part of the history. The bureaucratic handling of the next of kin. The family of the lost cosmonaut would receive a knock on the door. They would be told a fabricated story. Your daughter died in a parachute training accident. Your son died in a plane crash during a routine transfer. They were forbidden from opening the coffin. The coffin was often sealed, or filled with sandbags to simulate weight. The grave would be marked with a vague date. There would be no mention of space, no mention of the stars. The hero was grounded forever. The brothers at Torre Bert documented this silence in their logs. May 23, 1961, signal ceases. No official announcement. Frequency dead. These log entries are the only tombstones these people have. The contrast with the American program is striking. When NASA failed, the rockets exploded on live TV. It was humiliating, but it was honest. The Soviet silence created a myth of invincibility. By hiding the failures, they made it seem like they never made mistakes. But the cost of that perfection was the truth. The atmosphere in the bunker at Torre Bert changed after this event. The brothers realized they were not just radio enthusiasts. They were witnesses to a crime. The silence made them paranoid. If the Soviets could erase a cosmonaut, could they erase a listening station? The brothers began to look over their shoulders. They began to make copies of the tapes and hide them in different locations. The silence was contagious. It spread from Moscow to Turin. We must consider the ghost ships that remain. Not all crashes hit the ground. Some failures result in zombie satellites. If the pilot died but the craft remained in orbit, it becomes a silent tomb circling the Earth. The silence of the radio is matched by the silence of the vacuum. The Torre Bert archive lists several signals that simply drifted away. These objects are still up there. They are catalogued by the US Space Command as debris, but they are not just metal. They are monuments to the silence. Every 90 minutes they pass over our heads. They pass over the graves of the men who erased them. They pass over the museums that do not hold their names. The silence after the crash is not empty. It is full of ghosts. As we close the file on the silence after the crash, we must acknowledge the psychological toll it took on the listeners. The Judica Cordiglia brothers carried this silence for 50 years. They grew old listening to the static. They waited for someone to admit the truth. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, some files were opened, some names were restored. Bondarenko, Nelyubov, but the Tower Woman, the SOS Drifter, their files remain closed. Or perhaps they were burned so thoroughly that there is no file left to open. The archive chill is the realization that we will never know the full count. We know the ones the brothers heard, but what about the ones they missed? What about the ones who crashed on the other side of the world, when the brothers were asleep? The silence is vast. It covers the history of space travel like a shroud. Tonight, as you drift to sleep, listen to the quiet of your room. Realize that silence is a luxury. For the lost cosmonauts, silence was the final insult. But because of the archive, because of the bros, and because we are listening tonight, the silence is broken. We have heard the crash. We have heard the cover-up. But there is one final piece of the puzzle. The methods used to enforce this silence were not just bureaucratic. They were ruthless. The next file in the archive explores the Soviet method of erasing history. It explores how they altered photographs, how they intimidated witnesses, and how the brothers at Torre Bert became targets themselves. The tape is the silence is recorded. We prepare to open the final chapter of the conspiracy. In the digital age, we understand that an image can be manipulated. We know that pixels can be altered. But in the Soviet Union during the 1960s, reality itself was editable. The state possessed a weapon as powerful as the nuclear bomb, but it was silent. It was the airbrush. When a cosmonaut died in a way that embarrassed the Kremlin, they did not just bury the body, they buried the memory. They went into the archives with scalpels and ink. They removed men from group photographs. They scratched names off flight logs. They created a version of history where failure was mathematically impossible. This file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight with the dark art of the Soviet darkroom. We will examine the photographs where ghosts appear, floating hands, mismatched shadows, and the empty spaces where heroes used to stand. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. Let us step into the office of Glavlitha General, Directorate for the Protection of State Secrets in the Press. It is a windowless room in Moscow. The air smells of vinegar and developing chemicals. A red safe light casts a bloody glow on the workbench. A man is leaning over a photograph. In his hand is a fine-point brush dipped in grey paint. He is painting over the face of a man who was once a candidate for the stars. With each stroke of the brush, he is unmaking a person. The silence in this room is absolute. to speak the name of the erased man as a crime. To understand the Soviet method, we must look at the Sochi 6 photograph. This is the Rosetta Stone of space censorship, taken in May 1961. It shows the top 6 cosmonauts relaxing at a resort in Sochi. They are young, handsome, the vanguard of the socialist future. In the original image, standing in the back row, is Grigory Nelyubov. He was talented, he was charismatic, he was arguably the best pilot in the group, second only to Gagarin. But Nelyubov had a flaw. He was arrogant. After a drunken altercation with a military patrol, he was expelled from the program. In the West, he would have been a former astronaut. In the Soviet Union, he became a non-passant. The archive Chill team has analyzed the subsequent versions of this photo. In the version released to the public in 1963, Nelyubov is gone, but the erasure is not perfect. The artist painted a new background over him, a trellis of roses, a garden wall, but they forgot one detail. Nelyubov's hand was resting on the shoulder of the man in front of him. In the doctored photo, the man in front still has a hand on his shoulder, but the arm attached to it fades into thin air. It is a ghost hand, a physical remnant of a man who was scrubbed from existence. This clumsiness is what makes the history so fascinating to the Tier 1 audience. It reveals the arrogance of the state. They believed they controlled perception so completely that no one would notice a floating hand. Or perhaps, they wanted people to notice. Perhaps the ghost hand was a warning. Look closely, it says. We can remove you, and we won't even bother to tidy up the edges. The method extended beyond photographs. It applied to the hardware itself. When a Vostok mission failed, the serial numbers were reassigned. If Vostok 2 crashed, the next rocket would be painted with Vostok 2. This created a continuity of success. The engineers at the launch site knew, the mechanics knew, but they lived in a society of doublethink. They knew that Vostok 2 had crashed, but they also knew that Vostok 2 was sitting on the pad. Both facts were true. One was physical truth, the other was political truth, and in the Soviet Union, political truth was the only one that mattered. The Judica Cordiglia brothers at Torre Bert were the enemies of this method. They were recording the physical truth. A radio signal cannot be airbrushed. A Doppler shift cannot be retouched. The brothers possessed the negatives of history, the raw, unedited data. This is why the Soviet intelligence agencies feared them. The brothers were holding the missing pieces of the puzzle. Let us consider the psychological toll of this erasure on the surviving cosmonauts. Yuri Gagarin, Titov, Leonov, they all knew. They looked at the official photos and saw the gaps. They saw the empty chairs at the banquet table. They knew that if they made a mistake, if they panicked on the radio, or if they crashed, they too would be painted over. This adds a layer of quiet dread to every mission. They were not just fighting gravity, they were fighting oblivion. The boring history of censorship is a catalogue of techniques. Scalpels were used to scrape the emulsion off the film. Airbrushes were used to spray grey clouds over faces. Ink was used to black out names and documents. But the most effective tool was fear. The fear of being the next one to vanish. We must apply this method to the cases. We have heard, the Tower Woman and the SOS Drifter. Why are there no names for them? Because the Soviet method was preventative. Cosmonauts' names were state secrets until they landed safely. If the mission failed, the name was never released. The person was simply a test pilot, who died in an unrelated accident. This is why the archive is filled with unknowns. The eraser was applied before the ink was even dry. The archive chill experience is the act of trying to see through the paint. We look at the grainy photos of the early cosmonaut trainees. We count the heads. We see a shoulder here, a knee there. That doesn't belong to anyone. We are archaeologists of the photograph. We are digging for the people who were thrown into the memory hole. As we close the file on the Soviet method, we realize that the greatest trick the state pulled was convincing the world that the space race was a clean competition. It was not. It was a dirty, dangerous, and often fatal struggle. The beautiful, clean photos of smiling cosmonauts were a mask. Behind the mask was the burning metal, the screaming radios, and the silent dark rooms. This brings us to the ultimate case of erasure. There is one man who was not just erased from a photo, but erased from the sky itself. He was a famous pilot, a general's son. He was destined to be the first man in space, but he disappeared days before the launch. And when he reappeared, he was broken, silent, and hidden in a hospital in China. The Soviet method tried to erase his flight. They tried to turn him into a car crash victim, but the brothers at Torre Bert heard his voice, and the next file in our archive is dedicated entirely to him. The eraser can remove a face, but it cannot remove a legend. We prepared to open the file on the most famous non-person of the Cold War, the man who fell to Earth and was told he never flew. The file of Vladimir Ilyushin. We are taught that history has only one winner. In the race to be the first human in space, the winner is Yuri Gagarin. His smile is famous. His helmet is iconic, but in the shadows of the Kremlin archives, there is a persistent whisper that Gagarin was not the first. He was merely the first to return publicly. There was another man, a man who was taller, stronger, and more famous than Gagarin. A man who was the son of a legendary aircraft designer. His name was Vladimir Ilyushin. According to classified intelligence reports from 1961, Ilyushin launched 5 days before Gagarin. He reached orbit. He saw the stars, but he did not land in the Soviet Union. He crashed in China. Because of this error, he was erased. The Soviet machine invented a story about a car accident to explain his broken body. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight with the story of the man who fell to Earth and was told he never flew. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. Let us visualize a hospital room in Hangzhou, China, in April 1961. The blinds are drawn. The air smells of antiseptic and stale tea. In the bed lies a man wrapped in bandages. He is a Soviet pilot, but he is surrounded by Chinese guards. He is the most valuable prisoner in the world. He looks out the window at a sky he just fell from. He knows that back home in Moscow they are already rewriting his life. They are typing the press release that will turn his cosmic tragedy into a mundane traffic accident. He closes his eyes and listens to the silence of his own ERASURE. To understand the weight of the Vladimir Ilyushin mystery, we must first understand who he was. He was not an unknown farm boy like Gagarin. He was Soviet royalty. His father was Sergei Ilyushin, the genius engineer behind the Ilyushin attack aircraft that helped win World War II. Vladimir grew up in the cockpit. By 1960, he was arguably the greatest test pilot in the USSR. He held the world altitude record for a dynamic zoom climb in a jet aircraft. He had flown Mach 2. He was handsome, intelligent, and politically connected. If you were a betting man in 1960, and you had to bet on who would be the first man in space, you would bet on Vladimir Ilyushin. He was the golden boy. He was the perfect face for the socialist future. So, why did Gagarin get the glory? The archive chill theory posits that Ilyushin was chosen. The timeline is critical here. The Americans were preparing to launch Alan Shepard in May 1961. The Soviets knew this. They had to launch in April to secure the victory. Intelligence leaks from Moscow suggest that the launch date was set for April 7, 1961. This is 5 days before Gagarin's flight on April 12. Let us look at the evidence provided by the journalist Denis Ogden. Ogden was the Moscow correspondent for the Daily Worker, a communist newspaper. He was well connected. He had sources inside the party. On April 11, 1961, 1 day before Gagarin launched, Ogden filed a story that shocked the West. He reported that the Soviet Union had already launched a man into space. He reported that the man was suffering from post-flight effects and was in seclusion. Where did Ogden get this information? Was he hallucinating, or was he seeing the chaotic aftermath of the Ilyushin mission? The theory suggests the following sequence of events. On April 7, the Vostok capsule carrying Ilyushin blasts off. The launch is successful. He achieves orbit. The Judica Cordiglia brothers at Torre Bert record a heartbeat and breathing. But then, the guidance system fails. We have discussed this failure mode before. The retro rockets fire, but the orientation is slightly off. Instead of landing in the soft snow of Kazakhstan, the capsule overshoots. It travels thousands of miles further east. It crosses the border. It lands hard in the People's Republic of China. This was the worst-case scenario for Nikita Khrushchev. Relations between the USSR and China were crumbling. Mao Zedong and Khrushchev were rivals for the leadership of the communist world. To have the Soviet first man in space captured by China was a humiliation. It was a diplomatic disaster. If they announced the flight, they would have to admit the pilot was in Chinese custody. They would have to negotiate for his return. The Chinese would use him as leverage, so the decision was made. The flight never happened. The capsule was likely recovered by the Chinese military and studied. Ilyushin was held in a hospital, and in Moscow, the backup plan was activated. The backup plan was a young, smiling pilot named Yuri Gagarin. Gagarin was launched on April 12. His flight was shorter, only one orbit. It was safer, and it landed perfectly within Soviet territory. Gagarin became the hero. Ilyushin became the secret. Let us analyze the car accident cover story. Months after the rumored flight, Vladimir Ilyushin reappeared in public. He walked with a cane. He looked aged. The official story was that he had been in a car accident in June 1960, but there are holes in this story. First, why was the son of a top Soviet official sent to China for rehabilitation after a car crash? The official explanation was that Chinese Eastern medicine was better for his legs. This is absurd. The Soviet Union had the best trauma surgeons in the bloc. Sending him to China only makes sense if he was already in China because he fell there. Second, the nature of the injuries. Photographs of Ilyushin from the 1960s show a man who looks stiff. His movements are restricted. Aerospace medical experts have suggested that his posture is consistent with spinal compression. Spinal compression is a signature injury of a hard landing in a capsule. When a Vostok hits the ground, the impact force travels straight up the spine. A car accident usually causes whiplash or fractures from being thrown forward. A capsule crash crushes you from below. Ilyushin walked like a man who had been crushed from below. The boring history of this cover-up is fascinating because it required the complicity of hundreds of people. The launch crew, the recovery teams, the doctors, they all had to lie. They had to look at Ilyushin, the hero who went first, and pretend he was a clumsy driver. Imagine the psychological weight on Ilyushin himself. He had to watch Gagarin tours the world. He had to watch Gagarin hug the Queen of England. He had to watch Gagarin receive the medals that belonged to him. And he had to stay silent. He remained a loyal test pilot. He eventually became a general. He never broke his silence. But his eyes, in the later photos, tell the story of the archive chill. They are the eyes of a man who has seen the Earth from space, but is not allowed to say so. The Giudica Cordiglia brothers have a tape labeled The Breathing. It is dated early April 1961. It captures the sound of a person struggling to breathe. There is no speaking, just the ragged wet sound of lungs fighting for air. Was this Ilyushin during the Haiji? Was this the moment his capsule was spinning out of control towards the Chinese border? The archive cannot confirm the IAD, but the timing matches the Ogden report perfectly. The mystery of Vladimir Ilyushin is a paradox. He is a man who is both famous and erased. His name is in the history books as a test pilot, but his greatest achievement, if the theory is true, is written in invisible ink. He is the shadow Gagarin, and his story reminds us that history is not just what happened, it is what the state decides to write down. We must consider the legacy of Vladimir Ilyushin in the context of the archive chill. He passed away in 2010. He took the secret to his grave. Unlike American astronauts who wrote memoirs and gave interviews, Ilyushin remained a soldier of the state until the end. But his silence speaks louder than any confession. In an interview shortly before his death, when asked about the spaceflight rumors, he did not deny them angrily. He simply smiled and said, "We leave those stories to the storytellers." It was the non-denial of a man who knows the truth is safely buried. The Ilyushin case serves as the perfect bookend to the Lost Cosmonaut saga. We have the heartbeat, a biological proof of life. We have the SOS, a proof of departure. We have the burning woman, a proof of death. And we have Ilyushin, a proof of erasure. Together, these files create a mosaic of the hidden space age. A parallel timeline where the losses were heavy and the heroes were nameless. The Tier 1 audience, listening to this in the quiet of their homes, is invited to question the certainty of the past. We like to think that the 20th century was well documented. We have cameras, we have radios, we have newspapers. But the Ilyushin story proves that an entire reality can be hidden in plain sight. The physical evidence. The Vostok capsule that crashed in China is likely still there, hidden in a military warehouse in Beijing, rusted, stripped of its electronics. A metal sphere that fell from the sky in 1961. If that object were ever found, history would have to be rewritten. Statues would have to be changed. But for now, it remains a ghost story. As we close the file on Vladimir Ilyushin, we also close the heavy steel door of the Lost Cosmonauts section of the archive. We have spent hours listening to the static. We have heard the voices of the dead and the silenced. The purpose of this journey was not to frighten, but to remember. To remember that the darkness of space is indifferent to our politics. And to remember that for every name carved in stone, there is a name whispered in the wind. The server room is quieting down. The fans are spinning slower. The files are being returned to their encrypted folders. The red light of the dark room is turning off. The static is fading. We leave you tonight with one final thought. When you look up at the moon, or see a satellite tracking across the stars, do not just think of the ones who wave to the cameras. Think of the burning woman. Think of the man who walked with a limp because he fell from the heavens. They are the silent guardians of the high orbit, and they are still watching. The archive is closed. Sleep well. For thousands of years, humans have built tombs to preserve the dead. The pharaohs built pyramids of stone to stop the decay of their bodies. They wrapped themselves in linen and resin, hoping for eternity. But the most perfect tomb ever constructed was not built in Egypt. It was built in a factory in Moscow, and it orbits the Earth at 17,000 miles per hour. If a cosmonaut dies in a sealed capsule, the laws of biology stop. There is no oxygen for bacteria. There is no moisture for rot. There is only the absolute cold of the shadow and the absolute heat of the sun. The body does not decay. It freezes. It becomes a statue of ice and flesh, preserved perfectly for millions of years. The files on these specific missions were stamped "Never Open," not because they contained military secrets, but because they contained the locations of the only graveyards that will never be visited. We begin tonight with the physics of the tomb in high orbit. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. Let us shift our gaze from the radio dials of Torre Bert to the telescope. Imagine looking up at the night sky. It is a field of black velvet scattered with diamonds. It looks peaceful. It looks empty. But the archive tells us that the emptiness is an illusion. Between the stars, there are metal shapes. Some are the size of a bus. Others are the size of a car. They are tumbling silently in the void. They are the derelicts. The brothers at Torre Bert tracked them by sound until the batteries died. Now, we track them by gravity. To understand the tomb in high orbit, we must engage with the boring history of orbital mechanics and biology. This is where the story shifts from a thriller to a scientific study of the afterlife. When a human body dies on Earth, nature reclaims it. Microbes, insects, and oxidation break down the organic matter, dust to dust. But space is a sterile environment. It is the ultimate clean room. If the cabin pressure holds, if the capsule remains sealed, the cosmonaut inside is protected from the vacuum. But eventually, the air scrubbers fail. The oxygen runs out. The temperature drops to near absolute zero in the shadow of the Earth. The body freezes instantly. In this state, the cosmonaut becomes a mummy without the need for bandages. The face remains exactly as it was at the moment of death. The expression of fear, or peace, is locked in ice. If the cabin pressure fails, if the capsule was breached by a meteorite, or a structural failure, the process is different. This is called sublimation. In a vacuum, water does not melt. It turns directly from ice to gas. The water in the body would vaporize. The body would freeze dry. The result is a lightweight, perfectly preserved shell. It is a morbid detail, but it is scientifically accurate. The Lost Cosmonauts are the most well-preserved human beings in history. They are more intact than Lenin in his mausoleum. The Giudico Cordiglia brothers understood this permanence. When the SOS signal faded, they knew the craft didn't stop. Isaac Newton's first law of motion states, an object in motion remains in motion unless acted upon by an external force. In the vacuum of space, there is no air resistance. There is no friction. Once a capsule achieves orbit, it stays there, unless it fires a rocket to come down, or unless the drag of the thin upper atmosphere slowly pulls it down over decades. It will circle the Earth forever. Let us look at the catalogue of debris. The U.S. Space Surveillance Network tracks over 20,000 objects larger than a softball. Most are listed as rocket body or payload, but there are objects from the 1960s labeled Unknown Object 1961 Omicron, Object 1962 Alpha. These are the candidates for the tombs. They are silent. They do not reflect radar well, but they are there. Imagine the view from inside one of these tombs. The cosmonaut is sitting in the pilot's seat. They are strapped in. The instrument panel is dead. The gauges are frozen at zero. Out the window, the Earth spins. Blue oceans, white clouds, the lights of cities at night. They pass over their home country every 90 minutes. They pass over their own funeral. They pass over the statues built to honor the safe heroes. It is the ultimate exile, to be constantly in sight of home but never able to touch it. The archive chill comes from the realization of time. These tombs will outlast the pyramids. They will outlast the cities below. In 10,000 years, if humanity is gone, the Vostok capsules will still be there. They are the longest-lasting monuments we have ever built, and inside them are the lonely travelers. The brothers at Torre Bert often speculated about the soul in orbit. Giovanni was an engineer, but he was also a religious man. He wondered, if the body is trapped in the sky, is the soul trapped too? Does the ghost haunt the vacuum? This is why they kept the tapes. The tapes were the only proof that these metal tombs contained something sacred. Let us analyze the what-if of recovery. Technically, we have the technology to retrieve them. The space shuttle when it flew or a modern robotic probe could match the orbit. We could grab the capsule with a robotic arm. We could bring it down. But no nation, neither Russia nor the US, has ever proposed a mission to recover the unknowns. Why? Because opening the tomb would reveal the truth. If we brought down a capsule from 1961 and opened the hatch, we would find a Soviet pilot wearing a flight suit that doesn't appear in the official catalog. We would find a name tag that was erased from the history books. The body would be the evidence of the crime. So, the tombs are left in the sky. It is a mutually assured destruction of history. The West doesn't ask, and the East doesn't tell. The listener, lying in bed, can visualize the silence of this orbit. There is no wind. There is no sound. Just the slow rotation of the capsule. Sunlight, shadow, sunlight, shadow. It is a hypnotic cycle. It is a boring history that stretches into infinity. We must also consider the fetus, the ones who left Earth's orbit entirely. The SOS signal we discussed earlier indicated a craft moving away from Earth. This tomb is not circling us. It is circling the sun. It has become a planetoid. This cosmonaut is the loneliest human in the universe. They are traveling through the asteroid belt. They are passing Mars. They are in a heliocentric orbit. The preservation here is even more absolute. Far from the Earth, the temperature is constant. The radiation is pure. This tomb will orbit the sun for billions of years. Long after the Earth is consumed by the sun's expansion, this tiny metal coffin will still be flying. It is a terrifying form of immortality. The Giudica Cordiglia brothers marked these trajectories on their star maps. They drew lines in red ink. Last known vector. Those lines point into the deep dark. When you look at the constellation of Sagittarius or Scorpio, you are looking in the direction of a lost soul. The archive chill is not just about the past, it is about the presence. The reason this story keeps us awake is because the tombs are not gone. They are overhead. Right now, as you listen to this, one of them might be passing above your roof, a silent witness to your sleep. The existence of the tomb in high orbit changes our relationship with the sky. We used to look up and see gods, then we looked up and saw science. Now, thanks to the archive, we look up and see a graveyard, but it is a beautiful graveyard. It is clean, it is silent, it is studded. Perhaps it is not a bad way to rest, to float forever in the ocean of night, watching the world turn, untouched by time or decay. As we prepare to open the final file of this series, we must ask the question: why do we keep these secrets? Why does the file remain stamped never open? It is not just about protecting the reputation of a fallen empire. It is about protecting us, the living, from the reality of the cold. The final subtitle explores the bureaucracy of the secret, the reason why, even 60 years later, the names are still redacted, and why the brothers at Torre Bert were never given the medal they deserved. The telescope is capped, the star map is folded, but the orbit continues. The tomb is still flying. The Soviet Union collapsed. On December 26, 1991, the hammer and sickle flag was lowered from the Kremlin. The KGB was disbanded. The Iron Curtain was torn down. We were promised that the archives would be opened, that the secrets of the Cold War would be laid bare for the world to see. And indeed, many files were released. We learned about the gulags. We learned about the nuclear accidents. But there is one section of the archive that remains stubbornly shut. The files labeled Vostok failures and pre-Gagarin launches are still sealed. Why? The empire that created them is dead. The ideology is gone. The men involved are ghosts. The answer is terrifyingly simple: inertia. To declassify a lie of this magnitude requires an admission that the entire foundation of the space age was built on a graveyard. It requires rewriting the textbooks. It requires apologizing to the dead. The file was stamped never open, and tonight we conclude our journey by understanding why the lock is still on the door. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. Let us walk through the corridors of the modern Russian State Archive. It is a labyrinth of steel shelves. The air is dry. The smell is of old paper and ozone. Somewhere in this building, or perhaps in a military vault in Podolsky, there is a box. Inside the box are the flight logs of Vladimir Ilyushin, the autopsy report of the woman who burned the telemetry tapes of the SOS signal. They are gathering dust. They are fading, but they are still classified top secret. The silence in this room is not peaceful. It is heavy. It is the weight of a 60-year-old lie that refuses to die. To understand why the files remain classified, we must understand the psychology of the state. Governments do not like to admit weakness. Even a new government, like the Russian Federation, protects the legacy of the old one. Space exploration is a source of immense national pride. Yuri Gagarin is a saint. He is the symbol of Russian technological supremacy. To admit that Gagarin was not first to admit that he was the safe backup plan after Ilyushin crashed would tarnish the icon. It would turn a perfect victory into a messy cover-up. So, the state chooses the path of least resistance, silence. They simply do not answer the requests. Historians ask for the file. The request is denied. National security. How can a dead cosmonaut from 1961 be a threat to national security in 2025? Because the threat is not military, it is historical. The threat is the truth. There is also the inertia of secrecy. Once a file is marked top secret, it stays that way until someone with enough power decides to downgrade it. But no politician wants to be the one to open the Pandora's box. Who wants to be the official who tells the world, we let a woman burn to death and then lied about it for 50 years? No one. So the stamp remains. The box stays closed. The archive chill comes from this bureaucratic cowardice. It is the banality of evil. It is not a grand conspiracy anymore. It is just paperwork. But while the official files are closed, the unofficial archive is open, and this is the legacy of the Giudica Cordelia brothers. Achille and Giovanni created the only archive that matters. They didn't need permission, they didn't need declassification, they simply pulled the truth out of the air. Their tapes are the people's archive. They prove that history belongs to those who listen, not those who rule. The brothers faced immense pressure to destroy their tapes. The Soviets called them liars. Even the Americans were skeptical because the CIA didn't want to admit that 2 Italian students had better intelligence than the US government. But the brothers kept the tapes. They digitized them. They shared them. Because of them, the lost cosmonauts are not truly lost. We know their voices. We know their heartbeats. We know they existed. The final tragedy of the classified files is the lack of closure for the family. Imagine being the mother of the SOS drifter. You were told your son died in a training accident. You were given a fake urn with ashes, but deep down, you wonder. You look at the night sky and you wonder. If the files were opened, these families could finally have the truth. They could know exactly when, where, and how their loved ones died. But the state denies them this piece. The boring history of redaction is a history of cruelty. Let us speculate on what would happen if the files were opened tomorrow. We would see the photos of the crash sites. We would see the unedited transcripts of the final transmissions. We would see the medical reports of the phantom injuries. It would confirm everything the brothers heard. It would validate the archive chill. But until that day comes, we are left with the audio, and audio is a powerful ghost. You can burn a paper file. You can delete a digital file. But you cannot unring a bell. The radio waves sent by the dying cosmonauts are still traveling through the universe. They have passed the star Vega. They are heading toward the center of the galaxy. The truth is not locked in a vault in Moscow. The truth is expanding at the speed of light. As we end our broadcast tonight, the server room lights are dimming. The reels of tape at Torre Bert have stopped spinning. The brothers, Achille and Giovanni, have done their work. They have passed the torch to us. We have opened the files that were never meant to be opened. We have heard the heartbeat. We have heard the SOS. We have heard the fire. We have heard the silence. These stories are heavy. They are full of cold drafts and dark corners. But there is a strange comfort in knowing the truth. It reminds us that the human spirit is resilient. Even in the face of absolute isolation, even in the grip of the vacuum, these men and women tried to communicate. They tapped the key. They spoke into the microphone. They reached out. Now, it is time to close the archive. The secrets are safe with you. You are the witness now. Let the static of the radio fade into the background. Let the green noise of history wash over you. The world is turning. The stars are watching. The lost cosmonauts are drifting in their eternal slumber. They are at peace in the high orbit. And you are safe in your bed. Gravity holds you. The air surrounds you. The silence of your room is not the silence of the void. It is the silence of rest. Drift away from the tower. Drift away from the signal. Drift into the quiet. The file is closed. The recording ends. Good night.